Welcome back to another epic journey through the blood-soaked pages of Westeros history. I'm your chronicler of forgotten tales, and before we dive into tonight's legendary story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries that shaped the Seven Kingdoms. Picture this. A tower stands alone in the red mountains of Dawn. Inside, three of the greatest knights who ever lived guard a single door with their lives. Outside, 7 men approach through the morning mist, led by the most honorable man in the Seven Kingdoms. Steel rings against steel. When the dust settles, only 2 men remain alive, and one of them carries a secret that will haunt him for the rest of his days. But that tower, that bloody confrontation, that earth-shattering secret, it all began with a single blue rose, a crown of winter roses placed on the lap of a girl who was promised to another. One moment of shocking beauty at a tournament that would ignite a war, topple a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries, and birth a lie that would protect the realm itself. Tonight we journey back to when dragons still flew, when kings could burn men alive for sport, when love and honor collided with such devastating force that the very foundations of Westeros trembled. This is the complete story of Robert's Rebellion, the war that changed everything, told as it happened, moment by moment, battle by battle, death by death. You'll witness the Mad King's final descent into madness as he plots to burn his own capital to ash. You'll stand beside Robert Baratheon as his war hammer crushes the chest of the last dragon in the ruby waters of the Trident. You'll feel the weight of Ned Stark's impossible choice as he holds a secret that could save a life or damn the realm. But first, we must go back to when the realm seemed at peace, when a silver-haired prince played his harp and dreamed of prophecies, when a wolf maid rode through the godswood with flowers in her hair, laughing at a future she would never see. Back to the last days of House Targaryen, when 300 years of dragon rule was about to end in fire and blood. The wheel was turning. The Game of Thrones was about to claim more lives than any war in living memory. And it all started with a crown of blue roses and a girl who was too beautiful, too wild, too alive for the world that tried to cage her. But who was she really? And what happened in that tower that changed the fate of every soul in Westeros? The answers lie ahead, in the bloodiest tale ever told. In the year 282 after Aegon's conquest, Westeros sprawled beneath an uneasy peace. From the icy wall in the north to the burning sands of Dawn, 7 kingdoms bowed to one crown, one throne, one king. But that king had gone mad. Aerys Targaryen, second of his name, sat the Iron Throne in King's Landing like a corpse that refused to die. Once golden-haired and handsome, once called the Promising Prince, he had become something else entirely. His fingernails had grown long and yellow, curling like claws. His hair hung in greasy tangles past his shoulders, unwashed for months because he believed his enemies would try to poison him during his bath. Scabs covered his hands where he had cut himself on the throne's twisted metal, for Aerys had developed a habit of fidgeting with the blades while holding court. But it was his eyes that told the true story. Purple flames danced in those eyes, the fire of madness that burned brighter each day. He trusted no one, suspected everyone, and spoke constantly of traitors and conspiracies that existed only in his fevered mind. His queen, Rhaegar, bore the scars of his paranoid rages, while his courtiers walked on eggshells, knowing that a single wrong word could mean death by fire. The throne room reeked of fear and wildfire. Green flames had become the Mad King's obsession. He kept jars of the substance close at hand, watching the liquid fire swirl and dance while he planned elaborate executions for imagined enemies. The pyromancers had become his closest advisors, whispering in his ears about the ancient Targaryen words, fire and blood. Yet even in this rotting court, there were those who still believed in honor, in duty, in something greater than themselves. Jon Arryn, The aging Lord of the Vale served as Hand of the King with quiet dignity, trying to hold the realm together despite his king's madness. He had raised 2 young lords as his own sons, teaching them the ways of honor and justice in his mountain stronghold called the Eyrie. The first was Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, a giant of a man with coal-black hair and eyes like blue storms. At 20 years old, Robert stood 6.5 feet tall, broad as an ox, strong as a bull, with a laugh that could shake the rafters and a smile that could charm the birds from the trees. He wielded a war hammer so massive that most men could barely lift it with both hands, yet Robert swung it one-handed like it weighed nothing at all. He loved 3 things above all others: fighting, feasting, and a certain gray-eyed girl from the north. The second was Ned Stark, called Ned, the second son of Winterfell, who never expected to rule, but carried himself with the quiet strength of ancient kings, where Robert was fire and storm. Ned was ice and steel, dark-haired and gray-eyed like all the Starks. He spoke softly, but carried the authority of winter itself. Honor was not just a word to Ned Stark, it was the core of his being, the measure by which he judged all men, and by which he expected to be judged when his time came. These 2 young lords had been forged into brothers by Jon Arryn's wisdom and the bonds of shared youth. They sparred together in the training yard, hunted together in the mountains, and dreamed together of the futures that awaited them. Robert would return to Storm's End to rule the Stormlands, while Ned would serve his older brother Brandon as a loyal second son. Both would marry for love and duty, raise children, and live long, peaceful lives. But fate had other plans. In the north, at the ancient stronghold of Winterfell, lived a girl who would change everything. Lyanna Stark was Brandon's sister, and Ned's only sister, a maid of 15 with the wild beauty of the wolf blood that ran in the Stark line. She had long dark hair that flowed like water, gray eyes that sparkled with mischief and fire, and a laugh that could make even the sternest northern lord smile despite himself. She rode like the wind itself, fought with sword and bow like a warrior born, and possessed a spirit so fierce and free that it seemed she could never be caged by anyone or anything. Lyanna was promised to Robert Baratheon in a match that would unite the great houses of North and South, Ice and Storm. Their children would be kings and queens, the songs said. Their love would be legendary. But Lyanna Stark had never asked to be a song. She had never asked to be a bride. And somewhere in the South, a silver-haired prince played his harp and dreamed of prophecies that would require a wolf's blood to fulfill. The Game of Thrones was about to begin, and everyone would play whether they chose to or not. The year 281 dawned with promise across the 7 kingdoms, yet beneath the surface, currents of change were already stirring. In the ruins of Harrenhal, the greatest castle ever built in Westeros, preparations began for what would become the most magnificent tournament in living memory. Lord Walter Went had announced prizes so generous that knights would travel from every corner of the realm to compete. 40,000 dragons for the champion, 20,000 for the runner-up, and 10,000 for the victor of the melee. Such wealth had never been offered before, and many whispered that Lord Went could hardly afford such extravagance on his own. They were right to whisper. Behind the tournament's grand facade lay something far more dangerous than tilting at rings or cracking heads with blunted swords. The great lords of Westeros had grown weary of their mad king's increasingly erratic behavior. Robert's father-in-law-to-be, Lord Rickard Stark, had been building what the Maesters called the Southron Ambitions, a web of marriage alliances designed to check Targaryen power. His son Brandon was to wed Catelyn Tully, while his daughter Lyanna would marry Robert Baratheon. Jon Arryn himself had agreed to take Lysa Tully as his bride, connecting the great houses of North, South, East and the fertile Riverlands in a network that could challenge even dragons. The tournament at Harrenhal provided the perfect cover for these lords to meet without arousing the Mad King's suspicions. After all, What could be more innocent than knights gathering to celebrate the chivalric ideals of the Seven Kingdoms? Prince Rhaegar Targaryen arrived at Harrenhal like something from the songs of old, tall and lean. With the classical Targaryen features of silver gold hair and deep purple eyes, he moved with the fluid grace of a natural warrior, despite his reputation as a scholarly, melancholy prince. His armor was black as midnight, decorated with the three-headed dragon of his house, worked in rubies that caught the light like drops of blood. But it was his presence that truly commanded attention. Men and women alike found themselves drawn to him, sensing something otherworldly in his bearing, as if he carried the weight of destiny itself upon his shoulders. Rhaegar had not always been a warrior. As a boy, he had spent his days buried in dusty tomes and ancient prophecies, particularly those concerning the prince that was promised, a figure from Targaryen lore who would be born again to save the world from a coming darkness. It was only after reading something in those crumbling pages that the bookish prince had suddenly taken up sword and shield, declaring that he must be a warrior. What he had read remained his secret, but those closest to him noticed how his purple eyes would sometimes grow distant, as if seeing visions of futures yet to come. The tournament proceeded with all the pageantry expected of such a grand affair. Knights thundered down the lists, lances splintering against shields, while crowds roared their approval. Robert Baratheon dominated the melee as expected, his war hammer leaving a trail of dented armor and groaning opponents in his wake. His laughter rang across the field as he helped fallen foes to their feet, buying them wine and regaling them with tales of the battle they had just fought. This was Robert in his element, magnificent and alive, a force of nature wrapped in steel and good humor. But it was the Mystery Knight who captured everyone's imagination. On the second day, a small figure appeared in mismatched armor, carrying a shield painted with a laughing weirwood tree. The Knight of the Laughing Tree, as the crowds dubbed this unknown warrior, defeated 3 knights in succession, each of whom had apparently mistreated their squires. The mysterious knight's demands were simple: teach your squires honor and courtesy, or face the consequences. After each victory, the knight would disappear back into the crowd, refusing to reveal their identity despite increasingly large offers of gold and favor. King Aerys, already deep in his paranoid delusions, became convinced that the Knight of the Laughing Tree was one of his enemies in disguise, possibly even plotting his assassination. He commanded his son to unmask this mysterious warrior and bring them before the throne for questioning. Prince Rhaegar rode out the next morning with a small party of men, ostensibly to track down the unknown knight. He returned hours later, reporting that he had found only an abandoned shield beside a tree with no trace of the warrior who had carried it. What Rhaegar had actually discovered during those missing hours, he never revealed. But those who knew him best noticed a change in the prince after that morning ride. He grew more thoughtful, more distant, as if wrestling with some momentous decision that would reshape not just his own fate, but the destiny of the entire realm. The tournament's final day brought the ultimate test of knightly prowess. Prince Rhaegar emerged victorious from the jousting, defeating 4 knights of the Kingsguard and finally besting Ser Barristan Selmy himself in the final tilt. The crowd erupted as the last dragon claimed his crown of victory, a circlet of winter roses blue as the hearts of ice itself. According to ancient custom, the champion would crown the Queen of Love and Beauty, traditionally his wife or a lady of his family. Every eye turned toward the royal pavilion, where Princess Elia of Dorne sat beside Queen Rhaegar. Elia was Rhaegar's wife, mother of his children, a delicate beauty with the olive skin and dark eyes of her Dornish heritage. She had given him 2 babes already, Rhaenys and little Aegon, and deserved the honor by right of law and custom. Instead, Prince Rhaegar turned his horse toward another section of the stands entirely. Lyanna Stark sat among her family, wrapped in a grey cloak that matched her eyes, her dark hair crowned with a simple circlet that marked her as the daughter of a great house. She had been laughing at something her brother Benjen had whispered, her face bright with joy and utterly unconscious of her own beauty. When she realized that the Silver Prince was riding toward her, the laughter died on her lips, replaced by something far more complex. The entire field fell silent. 40,000 people held their breath as Prince Rhaegar extended the crown of winter roses toward the she-wolf of Winterfell. The blue petals seemed to glow in the afternoon sun as he placed them gently in her lap, his purple eyes meeting her grey ones for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The implications hit the crowd like a physical blow. Robert Baratheon's face went red as blood, his hands clenching into fists capable of crushing stone. Brandon Stark half rose from his seat, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword before his father's restraining grip pulled him back down. In the royal pavilion, Princess Elia's face remained perfectly composed, but those who knew her saw the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes flickered with hurt and confusion. Lyanna herself seemed frozen, staring down at the roses as if they were serpents that might strike at any moment. When she finally looked up, her grey eyes found Robert's across the field. What passed between them in that moment, no song would ever capture, but those who witnessed it would never forget the raw pain and bewilderment in the young lord's face. The feast that night proceeded under a cloud of tension, thick enough to cut with a sword. Prince Rhaegar played his silver harp and sang of ancient heroes and lost loves, his voice carrying a haunting beauty that brought tears to many eyes. But the song everyone heard was unspoken, hanging in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The Game of Thrones had gained new players, and the rules themselves were changing. In the weeks that followed, the lords and ladies dispersed to their castles, carrying with them memories of blue roses and questions that had no easy answers. Lord Rickard returned to Winterfell, his grand plans suddenly complicated by possibilities he had never considered. Robert rode back to Storm's End, his usual good humor replaced by a brooding silence that worried all who knew him. And in King's Landing, the Mad King's paranoia reached new heights as he convinced himself that the tournament had been a gathering of his enemies. He began to see traitors in every shadow, poison in every cup, daggers behind every smile. The pyromancers whispered in his ear about the cleansing power of wildfire, how green flames could burn away all deception and reveal the truth beneath. The realm held its breath, sensing that something fundamental had shifted at Harrenhal. The careful balance that had kept the Seven Kingdoms stable was beginning to crack, stress fractures spreading through the very foundations of Targaryen rule. Winter roses had never seemed so dangerous, nor blue petals so capable of drowning the world in blood. The months following Harrenhal passed like the calm before a summer storm, deceptively peaceful while pressure built in the very air itself. Lords returned to their castles with much to contemplate, but none more so than those directly touched by the prince's shocking gesture with the winter roses. In Winterfell's great hall, beneath the watchful eyes of carved direwolves, Lord Rickard Stark found himself navigating increasingly treacherous political waters. His daughter had become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Ravens arrived daily, carrying subtle inquiries from other great houses, each lord wondering what the Stark girl's crowning truly meant for their own plans and ambitions. Some saw opportunity in the apparent rift between Prince Rhaegar and his wife. Others sensed danger in any disruption to the carefully maintained balance of power that kept the realm stable. Lyanna herself seemed unchanged by the attention, at least on the surface. She continued her daily rides through the Godswood, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner as her horse thundered between the ancient trees. She practiced with sword and bow in the yard, often besting boys twice her age with a skill that would have been scandalous in the south, but was merely impressive in the north. Yet those who knew her best noticed subtle changes. she grew more thoughtful, more likely to stare into fires and lose herself in contemplations she shared with no one. Brandon, as her eldest brother and heir to Winterfell, felt the weight of protecting his sister's honor most keenly. The wild wolf of the Stark pack, as he was known throughout the north, possessed all the fire and fury of the wolf blood that ran in their line. Where Ned was ice and quiet strength, Brandon burned hot and bright, quick to anger, and quicker still to act when he perceived threats to those he loved. He had accepted Robert Baratheon as a brother, because Robert made Lyanna laugh, because the young Lord of Storm's End brought joy and light into her grey eyes. Now that joy seemed clouded with confusion and questions that had no easy answers, Robert himself had retreated to Storm's End after Harrenhal, throwing himself into the administration of his lands with an intensity that surprised those who knew him best. The laughing Storm had grown quieter, more prone to brooding silences that his friends found deeply unsettling. He still swung his massive warhammer in the practice yard each morning, but now there was a violence in his movements that spoke to deeper frustrations. When ravens arrived bearing news from other parts of the realm, he would read them with the focused attention of a man looking for enemies rather than the casual interest of a young lord learning statecraft. The breaking point came in early 282, when spring had fully settled over Westeros and the roads were clear of the last winter snows. Lyanna had ridden out from Riverrun, where she had been visiting her future good sister Catelyn Tully, with only a small escort of trusted men-at-arms. It was meant to be a simple journey north, following the well-traveled King's Road through the Riverlands toward the Neck, and eventually home to Winterfell. They never arrived. The first reports were confused, contradictory fragments carried by terrified travelers who claimed to have witnessed something near the inn at the crossroads. A party of knights in dark armor, they said, led by a tall figure whose face was hidden beneath a helm, worked with dragons. There had been no battle, no sounds of steel against steel, or screams of dying men. Instead, there had been words spoken too quietly for anyone to hear, followed by Lyanna Stark climbing willingly onto a horse behind the mysterious knight and riding south into the gathering dusk. Her escort had been found hours later, unharmed but bewildered, claiming that their lady had gone freely with men she seemed to know. Their weapons had not been drawn. No blood had been spilled, yet the daughter of Winterfell had vanished as surely as if she had been swallowed by the earth itself. When the news reached Winterfell, Brandon Stark's reaction was everything those who knew him might have expected, and worse than anyone could have feared. The young wolf's roar of rage echoed through the castle's stone corridors, sending servants scurrying for cover and causing even his father's most trusted knights to step carefully around his fury. He called for his horse and his sword, declaring his intention to ride south immediately and bring his sister home, no matter who had taken her or why. Lord Rickard, older and more cautious than his fiery heir, tried to counsel patience. Ravens were sent to King's Landing demanding answers, to Storm's End informing Robert of what had happened, to the Riverlands seeking any additional information about Lyanna's disappearance. But patience had never been Brandon's virtue, and with each passing day his sister remained missing. His anger burned hotter and brighter. The rumors began almost immediately, spreading through the 7 kingdoms like wildfire through dry grass. Prince Rhaegar had kidnapped the Stark girl, they whispered. The Dragon Prince had fallen in love with the Wolf Maiden and stolen her away from her promised husband. Some versions of the tale painted it as romantic, a prince rescuing a maiden from an unwanted marriage. Others spoke darkly of rape and murder, of Targaryen madness, expressing itself in violence against an innocent girl. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any song or story could capture. Those close to the royal family knew that Prince Rhaegar had been absent from King's Landing for several days around the time of Lyanna's disappearance, claiming the need for solitude to contemplate matters of prophecy and ancient lore. His wife, Princess Elia, had grown pale and withdrawn, spending long hours in prayer in the castle's sept, while her children played at her feet, seemingly oblivious to the storm building around their family. King Aerys himself seemed almost pleased by the rumors, as if his son's alleged crime somehow validated his own paranoid worldview. The Mad King had long suspected that his enemies were conspiring against him, and now he had proof that even his own blood would betray trust and honor for selfish desires. He spoke gleefully of the chaos this would bring, how it would force the great lords to show their true colors and reveal which ones were loyal and which were traitors in disguise. Meanwhile, ravens flew back and forth across the realm, as the great houses tried to make sense of what had happened and what it might mean for their own plans. Lord Hoster Tully found his carefully crafted alliance system suddenly threatened by scandal and uncertainty. Jon Arryn received frantic letters from both Robert and Ned, each seeking guidance from the man who had been father to them both. The Lords of the North began quietly mustering their forces, not yet calling their banners, but preparing for possibilities none of them wanted to contemplate. Through it all, Lyanna Stark remained missing, her fate unknown to all but a select few. Some claimed to have seen her riding south toward dawn, others insisted she had been taken to one of the free cities across the narrow sea. A few whispered that she was already dead, murdered to prevent her from revealing whatever secrets the Dragon Prince feared to have exposed. The truth was that she rode through the Dornish countryside with a small party of knights, including 3 members of the Kingsguard who had sworn their lives to protect the royal family. Prince Rhaegar himself led them, but gone was the melancholy harp player of Harrenhal. In his place rode a man transformed by purpose, driven by a conviction that would have seemed madness to anyone who did not understand the weight of the prophecies that haunted his dreams. Lyanna had chosen her path freely, but the realm would never believe it. How could a maiden of 15, no matter how spirited, choose exile and scandal over honor and a crown? How could she abandon her family, her betrothal, her very identity for a married prince whose own wife carried his children? The very idea challenged everything the lords and ladies of Westeros believed about duty and propriety. But Lyanna Stark had never been a conventional maiden, and the choice she made would echo through generations yet unborn. Brandon's patience finally shattered completely when a moon's turn had passed, with no word from his sister and no satisfactory answers from the capital. The young wolf saddled his horse and gathered a small party of friends, including Elbert Arryn, nephew to the Lord of the Vale, Geoffrey Lonmouth, a knight of the Stormlands, and Kyle Royce, heir to Runestone. Together they rode hard for King's Landing, their hearts full of righteous fury and their minds fixed on confronting the prince they believed had dishonored their families. They clattered through the gates of the capital like an approaching storm, their horses lathered with sweat and their eyes burning with the intensity of men who had ridden too hard and slept too little. Brandon made no attempt at subtlety or diplomacy as he dismounted in the Red Keep's courtyard and shouted his challenge for all to hear. "Come out and die, Rhaegar." His voice carried across the castle grounds, reaching every servant and guard, every lord and lady who happened to be within the ancient walls. The challenge was clear, unmistakable, and utterly damning in the eyes of Targaryen law. No subject could call for the death of a prince and expect to live long enough to repeat the mistake. But Prince Rhaegar was not in King's Landing to answer Brandon's challenge. He was hundreds of miles away, riding toward a destiny that would reshape the very foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. In his absence, only the Mad King remained to hear the wild wolf's roar of defiance. And Aerys Targaryen had been waiting for just such an opportunity to prove that his enemies were everywhere, even among those who should have been most loyal to the Iron Throne. The Red Keep had witnessed many horrors during the reign of Aerys Targaryen, but none would compare to what unfolded on that fateful day when Brandon Stark's challenge echoed through its ancient halls. The Mad King's purple eyes lit up with a terrible joy when guards brought word of the young wolf's demand for Prince Rhaegar's life. Here, at last, was the proof he had been seeking that his enemies had finally revealed themselves, casting aside all pretense of loyalty to openly threaten the royal family. Brandon and his companions found themselves seized before they could even comprehend the magnitude of their mistake. The Red Keep's guards, long accustomed to their king's paranoid commands, moved with practiced efficiency to surround the small party of Northern and Vale knights. There would be no fair trial, no careful examination of evidence or testimony. In Aerys's twisted mind, the very act of challenging a Targaryen prince constituted treason of the highest order, punishable by death in the most public and painful manner possible. The young men were thrown into the dungeons beneath the castle, dark stone cells that had held countless prisoners over the centuries. But these were not common criminals or foreign spies. Elbert Arryn was the nephew and heir of the Lord Paramount of the Vale. Geoffrey Lonmouth came from a respected house of the Stormlands. Kyle Royce would inherit one of the Vale's most ancient seats, and Brandon Stark was heir to Winterfell, future Warden of the North, whose family could trace their lineage back 8,000 years to the Age of Heroes. Their imprisonment sent shockwaves through the political landscape of Westeros. Ravens flew from the Red Keep carrying demands that the prisoners' fathers come to King's Landing to answer for their sons' crimes. Lord Jon Arryn received a summons written in the king's own hand, commanding him to appear before the Iron Throne to explain why his nephew had participated in treasonous threats against the crown. Lord Rickard Stark was ordered south to account for his son's actions and to face judgment for the apparent failures of northern upbringing that had produced such a rebellious heir. The messages were couched in the language of royal justice, but everyone who read them understood their true nature. These were not invitations to court proceedings, but commands to attend executions, with the fathers expected to witness the deaths of their sons before meeting similar fates themselves. Aerys had decided that the time for subtlety had passed, that the realm needed a demonstration of what happened to those who dared threaten the dragon's authority. Lord Rickard Stark received his summons at Winterfell on a grey morning when snow was falling softly in the Godswood, covering the ancient trees in a blanket of pristine white that would soon be stained with blood. The Lord of Winterfell was not a man given to dramatic displays of emotion, but those who knew him best saw the way his jaw tightened as he read the king's words, the slight tremor in his weathered hands that spoke to the depth of his anguish. He could have refused the summons. He could have called his banners and marched south with 20,000 northern swords at his back, determined to rescue his son through force of arms. Many of his lords counseled exactly such a course, arguing that the Mad King had finally revealed his true nature and that the North owed no loyalty to a crown stained with innocent blood. But Rickard Stark was a man of honor, shaped by generations of Stark tradition that placed duty and justice above personal desire. If his son had committed treason, then he would answer for it according to the laws of the realm. If Brandon's challenge had crossed the line from youthful anger into genuine criminality, then the Stark name demanded that accounts be settled properly through the ancient mechanisms of trial and judgment that had governed Westeros for centuries. He rode south with a small escort, carrying himself with the dignity befitting his station, while privately fearing that he rode to his death. The journey seemed to pass both too quickly and too slowly, each mile bringing him closer to a confrontation he dreaded, while every delay meant another day his son remained in the Mad King's dungeons, subject to whatever torments Aerys's paranoid imagination might devise. King's Landing received Lord Rickard with all the ceremony due his rank, but beneath the courtly pleasantries lay an atmosphere of barely contained menace. The city itself seemed infected by its king's madness, with guards looking nervously over their shoulders and courtiers speaking in whispers about omens and portents. The common folk had begun to mutter about green flames and wildfire, though none dared voice such concerns too loudly for fear of being reported to the king's growing network of informants. The trial, when it finally commenced, was a mockery of everything justice was meant to represent. Emerys sat the Iron Throne, like a corpse given malevolent life, his long fingernails clicking against the twisted metal, while his purple eyes surveyed the assembled court with suspicious glee. He had prepared something special for this occasion, a demonstration that would remind everyone present of the terrible power that flowed through Targaryen blood. Lord Rickard was given the right to trial by combat, as befitted his noble station, but when he named his champion and called for weapons to be brought, the Mad King's laughter filled the throne room like the sound of breaking glass. Rickard's champion would be fire itself, Aerys declared. Let the Lord of Winterfell prove his innocence by surviving the embrace of flames, as his Targaryen ancestors had done in ages past when their right to rule was questioned. A suit of armor was brought forth, crafted specifically for this perverse ritual. Lord Rickard was strapped inside the steel plates, while braziers were arranged around him, filled with wildfire that burned with an unnatural green glow. The Mad King watched from his throne with undisguised pleasure as the flames began to lick at the metal, slowly turning the armor into an oven that would cook its occupant alive. But Aerys's cruelty had only begun. Brandon was dragged from his cell and forced to watch his father's torment, a leather cord placed around his throat and a blade positioned just out of his reach. The young wolf was told that he could save his father's life if he could just reach the sword, but every movement forward tightened the cord around his neck, slowly strangling him while Lord Rickard burned mere feet away. The throne room fell silent, except for the crackling of wildfire and the desperate sounds of a son trying to save his father while killing himself in the process. Courtiers who had served the Targaryens for decades found themselves witnessing something that challenged their very understanding of royal justice. This was not the measured execution of a traitor, but the torture of innocence for the amusement of a madman. Lord Rickard Stark died as he had lived, with dignity and honor intact, despite the horrific circumstances of his death. His final words, spoken through the metal of his helm as the flames consumed him, were not pleas for mercy or curses against his tormentor, but instructions for his surviving son Ned to remember his duty to the North and to the values that had sustained House Stark through 8 millennia of rule. Brandon's death came moments later, his own fierce struggles to reach the sword that might save his father, ultimately proving his doom. The wild wolf of Winterfell died trying to protect those he loved, his final act a testament to the loyalty and courage that had always defined his character, even when those qualities led him into folly. The other young lords met similar fates over the following days, each execution designed to send a message to their respective regions that defiance of Targaryen authority would be met with the most extreme consequences. Elbert Arryn's death was particularly cruel, as he was forced to watch his companions die before facing the flames himself, his youth and innocence making his suffering all the more poignant. News of the execution spread across Westeros like wildfire itself, carried by ravens and travelers who had witnessed the Mad King's latest descent into barbarity. In Winterfell, the remaining Starks received word of their father and brother's deaths with the stoic acceptance that was their family's trademark, but beneath the surface, a cold fury began to build that would soon manifest itself in ways the Mad King could never have anticipated. At Storm's End, Robert Baratheon received the news while practicing with his war hammer in the castle's yard. The massive weapon slipped from his hands as the full implications of what he had heard sank in. His beloved's father and brother were dead, murdered by the very king he had sworn to serve. The woman he loved remained missing, presumably in the hands of the prince who had started this entire catastrophe. The carefully ordered world of his youth had collapsed into chaos and bloodshed. But it was Jon Arryn's reaction that would prove most consequential for the future of the Seven Kingdoms. The Lord of the Vale had raised Brandon and Robert as his own sons, teaching them honor and justice while preparing them to serve the realm with distinction. Now one of those sons was dead, murdered alongside his father in a display of cruelty that violated every principle of decent governance. When the Mad King's next raven arrived at the Eyrie, demanding that Jon Arryn surrender Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon to face similar justice for their association with the traitors, the Old Lord's response was swift and decisive. He would not deliver his fostered sons to their deaths. He would not bow before a king who had revealed himself to be nothing more than a murderer wearing a crown. The time for loyalty and patience had passed, replaced by a grim determination to see justice done for the innocents whose blood now stained the Iron Throne. War was no longer a possibility to be avoided, but an inevitability to be embraced. The realm would bleed, but from that blood might come a better future for all who called Westeros home. The dragons had ruled for 3 centuries through fire and blood, but now they would discover that wolves and stags and falcons could be just as deadly when properly motivated. The rebellion that would reshape the 7 kingdoms had begun, not with grand declarations or elaborate strategies, but with a father's love for his son and an old man's refusal to sacrifice honor on the altar of political convenience. The ravens that flew from the Eyrie carried more than words. They carried the death warrant of a dynasty. Jon Arryn's refusal to surrender his fostered sons transformed what might have remained a tragic but isolated incident into something far more dangerous for the Iron Throne. Within days of his declaration, the Mountain Lords of the Vale began the quiet preparations that would soon escalate into open rebellion against 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. The Vale had always been considered the most defensible of the 7 kingdoms, protected by the towering peaks of the Mountains of the Moon, and accessible only through a handful of treacherous passes that could be held by small forces against much larger armies. This natural fortress now became the heart of resistance against Aerys's madness, as Lord Jon Arryn called upon ancient oaths and feudal obligations that bound the mountain clans and noble houses to his service. Robert Baratheon received word of Arryn's decision while standing vigil in Storm's End Sept, praying to the 7 for guidance in the darkness that had engulfed his world. The young Lord of Storm's End had been wrestling with grief and rage since learning of Lord Rickard and Brandon's deaths, their murders striking him like physical blows that left him reeling with shock and fury. When Arryn's message arrived, declaring his intention to protect Ned Stark and fight the Mad King's tyranny, Robert felt something shift inside his chest, as if a weight he had been carrying suddenly lifted. The decision to rebel against his king was not one that Robert made lightly, despite his reputation for quick action and hot temper. He understood the magnitude of what they were contemplating, the vast scope of the forces arrayed against them, and the likelihood that many good men would die before this conflict reached its conclusion. But the alternative was to bow before a madman who murdered fathers and sons for sport, to accept that justice meant nothing when weighed against the whims of a deranged monarch. More than that, Lyanna remained missing, presumably held by Prince Rhaegar somewhere in the vast expanse of the 7 kingdoms. Every day she remained captive was another day of torment for Robert, another night spent imagining what horrors she might be enduring at the hands of the Dragon Prince. The rebellion offered him more than a chance for justice. It provided a path toward rescuing the woman he loved and bringing her safely home. Ned Stark's reaction to the news was characteristically more measured, but no less determined. The Quiet Wolf had become Lord of Winterfell through tragedy, inheriting responsibilities he had never expected to bear while still processing the brutal deaths of his father and elder brother. The boy who had grown up in Jon Arryn's household as a second son now found himself the leader of one of the most powerful houses in Westeros, with 20,000 swords waiting for his command. Unlike Robert, whose anger burned hot and bright, Ned's fury was cold as winter steel. He had loved his father and brother with the fierce loyalty that defined the Stark bloodline, and their murders had carved a wound in his soul that would never fully heal. But grief would not cloud his judgment or drive him to reckless action. If House Stark was to have its vengeance, It would be achieved through careful planning and strategic thinking, not wild charges driven by emotion. The early days of the rebellion unfolded with surprising swiftness as the conspiracy that had been building beneath the surface for years finally emerged into open warfare. The great houses that had formed marriage alliances with the Starks and Aryans found themselves faced with a choice that would define their futures for generations to come. Some, like the Tullys of Riverrun, had blood ties that made their decision inevitable. Others calculated the odds and chose sides based on their assessment of which faction was most likely to emerge victorious. Hoster Tully's support came at a price that demonstrated the cold realities of wartime politics. The Lord of Riverrun had 2 daughters of marriageable age, and he intended to use them to cement the alliance that would keep his lands safe during the coming storm. Catelyn, originally promised to Brandon Stark, would now wed his younger brother Ned, binding the North to the Riverlands through bonds of marriage and mutual obligation. Lysa, younger and more delicate, would marry Jon Arryn himself, despite the significant age difference between the aging Lord of the Vale and his teenage bride. These marriages were not love matches, but political necessities, unions designed to create unbreakable bonds between the rebel houses, while ensuring that future generations would have blood ties to maintain their alliances. The participants understood their duties and accepted them with the stoic resignation that defined noble marriages throughout Westeros. Personal happiness was a luxury that few could afford in times of war. The first battles of what would become known as Robert's Rebellion were small affairs, skirmishes between advance scouts and border patrols, as both sides tested their opponent's strength and commitment. In the Riverlands, Targaryen loyalists clashed with Tully forces along the Trident, while in the Stormlands, Robert's bannermen engaged royal troops who had been dispatched to capture Storm's End and end the rebellion before it could gather momentum. These early encounters revealed important information about the nature of the conflict that was developing. The rebels possessed significant advantages in terms of motivation and leadership, as their cause was driven by genuine outrage at the Mad King's crimes rather than mere political ambition. Their soldiers fought with the fury of men who believed they were defending justice itself against tyranny and madness. However, the royalist forces controlled the capital and the royal treasury, along with the loyalty of several powerful houses that remained committed to the Targaryen dynasty. The Reach, led by House Tyrell, commanded vast resources and could field armies larger than any other kingdom. Dorne, despite having no love for the current regime, remained officially loyal to the crown that Prince Rhaegar's wife represented. The Crownlands and much of the Stormlands still flew dragon banners, their lords either genuinely loyal to the king or too cautious to risk their positions on what many viewed as a doomed rebellion. The strategic situation was further complicated by the need to secure the Riverlands, which formed the geographic heart of Westeros and controlled the major river systems that facilitated trade and communication throughout the realm. House Tully's decision to join the rebellion was crucial, but their lands were exposed to attack from multiple directions and would require significant military support to defend effectively. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Aerys's reaction to news of the spreading rebellion confirmed his complete descent into paranoid madness. The king, who had once shown promise as a young prince, now raged through the Red Keep like a caged animal, seeing enemies and conspiracies in every shadow. His remaining advisors walked on eggshells, knowing that a single wrong word could result in their own deaths by wildfire. The Mad King's response to the rebellion was characteristically extreme and counterproductive. Rather than attempting to address the legitimate grievances that had sparked the uprising, he doubled down on the very behaviors that had caused the crisis in the first place. More nobles were arrested on suspicion of treason. More executions were carried out in the throne room's green flames. The royal treasury was depleted to fund increasingly elaborate schemes for rooting out imagined conspiracies among the court. Most ominously, Aerys began to speak more frequently about his ultimate solution to the problem of treacherous subjects. If the people of King's Landing could not be trusted to remain loyal, then perhaps they did not deserve to live at all. The caches of wildfire that had been placed throughout the city during his earlier paranoid episodes began to expand, with new stores of the volatile substance hidden in sewers, under septs, and beneath the very foundations of the Red Keep itself. The pyromancers, led by the ambitious Wisdom Rossart, encouraged these plans while secretly making their own preparations for what they viewed as an inevitable catastrophe. Some among their order had begun to question whether their king's commands could be reconciled with their duty to protect the realm, but none dared voice such doubts openly for fear of joining the growing list of traitors marked for death. As winter gave way to spring in the year 282, the political landscape of Westeros had been transformed beyond recognition. What had begun as a personal tragedy involving one noble family had evolved into a full-scale civil war that would determine not just who sat the Iron Throne, but what kind of kingdom would emerge from the ashes of the old order. The rebels controlled significant territory and commanded the loyalty of some of the realm's most capable military leaders, but they faced an uphill battle against a dynasty that had ruled through fire and blood for 3 centuries. Victory was possible, but it would require careful strategy, tremendous sacrifice, and more than a little luck to overcome the advantages that still favored the crown. The storm that would reshape the 7 kingdoms had begun in earnest, and no one could predict where the winds of war would ultimately carry them all. The ruins of Summerhall had stood as a monument to Targaryen hubris for nearly half a century. Its blackened stones, a reminder of the day King Aegon IV and Prince Duncan died in flames while attempting to hatch dragon eggs through fire and blood. Now, in the spring of 282, these same ruins would witness another pivotal moment in the dynasty's history, as Robert Baratheon chose this symbolically charged location for his first major confrontation with the royal forces. The irony was not lost on those who understood the site's dark history. Summerhall had been built as a pleasure palace, a place where Targaryen kings could escape the burdens of rule and indulge in scholarly pursuits and family gatherings away from the political pressures of King's Landing. Instead, it had become the tomb of a king who died trying to bring dragons back to the world, his dreams of restored Targaryen greatness literally going up in smoke. Robert's decision to make his stand at Summerhall was both strategic and deeply personal. The ruins lay in the Stormlands, close enough to his home territory that he could count on local support and knowledge of the terrain, yet positioned to threaten the approaches to King's Landing itself. More importantly, the choice sent a clear message to both his allies and enemies about the nature of this rebellion. He was not merely fighting for personal grievances or political advantage, but standing against the very essence of Targaryen rule that had brought nothing but madness and death to the realm. The royal army that marched to meet him represented the old order's attempt to crush this upstart rebellion before it could gather further momentum. Led by seasoned commanders who had served the crown faithfully for decades, the force numbered nearly 15,000 men. A formidable host that included heavy cavalry from the Crown Lands, disciplined infantry from the royal garrisons, and even a contingent of sellswords hired with gold from the royal treasury. At their head rode Lord Fell and Lord Catherine, both experienced battlefield commanders who understood the importance of ending Robert's rebellion quickly and decisively. They had served the Targaryens through previous conflicts and had no reason to doubt their ability to handle what they viewed as a collection of disgruntled nobles, led by an untested young lord whose reputation rested more on his prowess in tournaments than his skills as a military strategist. They could not have been more wrong about their opponent. Robert Baratheon, at 20 years old, was already a force of nature on the battlefield, possessed of a combination of size, strength, and tactical instinct that made him genuinely dangerous to any enemy foolish enough to face him in open combat. His warhammer, forged specially for his massive frame, had become legendary among those who had witnessed its devastating effectiveness in practice sessions and minor skirmishes. More than a weapon, it had become a symbol of the raw power that the young Lord of Storm's End brought to every confrontation. But Robert was more than just a mighty warrior. The months since his foster father's declaration of rebellion had transformed him from a pleasure-loving young lord into something harder and more focused. The grief and rage that consumed him over Lyanna's fate had been channeled into a cold determination to see justice done, while the responsibility of leading a rebellion had forced him to develop the strategic thinking that would be essential for victory against superior numbers. The battle began at dawn on a spring morning, when the mist still clung to the broken stones of Summerhall's walls. Robert had positioned his forces carefully, using the ruins themselves as defensive positions, while keeping his cavalry in reserve for the decisive moment when the royal lines began to waver. His men numbered fewer than 10,000, but they fought with the desperation of those who knew that defeat meant not just military loss, but personal destruction at the hands of a mad king. The initial assault came as expected, with royal forces attempting to overwhelm the rebel positions through sheer weight of numbers. Arrows darkened the sky as archers on both sides sought to thin their opponents' ranks before the real fighting began. The clash of steel on steel echoed through the ruins as infantry lines met in brutal melee combat, each side pushing forward with everything they possessed. Robert himself led from the front, his massive frame cutting through enemy ranks like a ship breaking through ocean waves. His warhammer rose and fell with mechanical precision, each strike either killing outright or sending armored opponents flying through the air with shattered bones and crushed armor. Men who had served in wars for decades stood in awe of the young lord's combat prowess, watching as he carved a path of destruction through the heart of the royal army. But the battle's outcome was decided by more than individual heroics. No matter how spectacular, Robert had learned from his foster father Jon Arryn and his military advisors the importance of timing and coordination in large-scale combat. When the royal forces committed their reserves to breaking what they believed was a weakening rebel line, Robert unleashed his cavalry in a coordinated charge that struck the enemy flank like a thunderbolt. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Soldiers who had been pressing forward confidently suddenly found themselves attacked from an unexpected direction by fresh troops, led by lords they recognized as formidable warriors. The carefully maintained formations that were essential for medieval warfare began to collapse as individual units found themselves isolated and surrounded by enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere. Lord Feld died early in the cavalry charge, his banner falling as rebel lances punched through his personal guard and reached the man himself. His death sent ripples of shock through the royal ranks as veteran soldiers realized that their commanders were not invincible and that this rebellion possessed both the will and the capability to kill anyone who stood against them. Lord Catherine's fate was even more dramatic, as he found himself face to face with Robert Baratheon in single combat amid the chaos of the collapsing battle line. The encounter lasted only moments, but those who witnessed it would speak of it for years afterward. Catherine was a skilled knight with decades of experience, but Robert's combination of size, strength, and fury made him an opponent unlike any the older man had ever faced. The warhammer's impact was heard across the battlefield, a sound like thunder that marked the end of another royal commander and the beginning of a complete rout. With their leaders dead and their formations shattered, the surviving royal forces broke and fled, abandoning their weapons and supplies in their desperate haste to escape the rebels who pursued them with savage enthusiasm. The victory at Summerhall transformed Robert from a regional rebel into a figure of national significance. Word of his triumph spread across the Seven Kingdoms with remarkable speed, carried by ravens, merchants, and traveling singers who embellished the tale with each retelling. The young Lord of Storm's End had not merely defeated a royal army, he had crushed it so thoroughly that survivors spoke of his prowess in terms normally reserved for legendary heroes from the Age of Heroes. More importantly, the battle proved that Targaryen forces could be beaten by mortal men wielding conventional weapons. For 3 centuries, the dragons had maintained their rule through the threat of overwhelming military superiority, but Robert's victory demonstrated that skill, courage, and determination could overcome even the most formidable opponents. Houses that had remained neutral suddenly began to reconsider their positions, while those already committed to the rebellion found their confidence significantly bolstered. The psychological impact extended beyond military considerations to touch the very foundations of Targaryen legitimacy. Kings ruled by divine right and military might, but what happened when that might proved insufficient against determined opposition? The aura of invincibility that had protected the Iron Throne for generations had been shattered by a young lord with a war hammer and the will to use it effectively. Robert's treatment of prisoners and civilians in the aftermath of Summerhall further enhanced his growing reputation. Unlike the Mad King, who responded to opposition with torture and murder, Robert showed mercy to those who surrendered and protection to non-combatants caught in the fighting. Common soldiers who laid down their arms were allowed to go home or join his forces if they chose. Nobles who yielded were treated with the respect due their stations and given opportunities to prove their loyalty to the rebel cause. This magnanimity was not merely strategic, though it certainly helped his cause by encouraging defections from the royal side. Robert genuinely believed in the principles that had driven him to rebellion in the first place, and treating defeated enemies with honor was part of demonstrating that his movement represented something better than the cruelty and madness that characterized Aerys' rule. The victory also had important implications for the rebellion's military strategy going forward. Control of Summerhall and its surrounding territory gave the rebels a secure base of operations within striking distance of King's Landing itself, while the elimination of a major royal army freed up significant forces for other operations. More houses began declaring for Robert, bringing with them the manpower and resources that would be essential for the larger battles that lay ahead. As news of Summerhall reached the Red Keep, Aerys' reaction was predictably extreme. The Mad King raged through his chambers, screaming about treachery and conspiracies, while demanding ever more elaborate punishments for those he blamed for the defeat. The wildfire caches throughout King's Landing grew larger and more numerous as the king's paranoia reached new heights, fed by military setbacks that challenged his fundamental beliefs about Targaryen supremacy. The Game of Thrones had entered a new phase, and Robert Baratheon had announced himself as a player capable of winning it all. Victory at Summerhall had transformed Robert Baratheon from a regional lord in rebellion into a figure of national significance, but success bred its own dangers. The young Lord of Storm's End found himself facing the intoxicating temptation that had destroyed many promising commanders throughout history, the belief that his previous triumph guaranteed future victories regardless of circumstances or opposition. This overconfidence would nearly prove fatal when he marched his forces into the Reach to face an enemy unlike any he had previously encountered. The Reach represented everything that made the Targaryen dynasty formidable when properly motivated. Led by House Tyrell of Highgarden, this vast and fertile kingdom could field larger armies than any other region of Westeros, while its agricultural wealth provided the resources necessary to sustain lengthy campaigns. More importantly, the Reach had remained loyal to the Iron Throne throughout the growing rebellion, viewing Robert's uprising as a temporary disturbance that would be crushed once the full weight of royal power was brought to bear. Lord Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden, embodied both the strengths and weaknesses of his region's military tradition. A competent administrator and capable politician, he commanded the respect of his bannermen through a combination of personal wealth and careful attention to their concerns and grievances. However, his battlefield experience was limited, and his strategic thinking tended toward the conventional approaches that had served the Reach well in previous conflicts, but might prove inadequate against an opponent as unconventional as Robert Baratheon. The decision to march into the Reach was driven by more than mere military considerations. Robert's advisors had identified the region as crucial to the rebellion's long-term success, arguing that control of its agricultural output and population centers would provide the resources necessary to sustain a prolonged war against the crown. Additionally, a victory in the Reach would demonstrate to neutral houses throughout Westeros that the rebels possessed the capability to project power far beyond their home territories. The Battle of Ashford unfolded on ground chosen by the Tyrell forces, a factor that should have warned Robert's commanders about the dangers they were courting. The Reach army had positioned itself to take maximum advantage of the flat, open terrain that favored their superior numbers, while minimizing the impact of the rebels' tactical innovations. When the two forces finally met in combat, the disparity in size became immediately apparent to everyone involved. Robert's army numbered fewer than 8,000 men, while the combined forces of the Reach approached 20,000, a numerical advantage that would have been decisive under normal circumstances. The rebel forces included many veterans of Summerhall who had developed confidence in their ability to overcome seemingly impossible odds, but confidence alone could not compensate for being outnumbered more than 2-1 by an enemy fighting on familiar ground. The battle began with a traditional exchange of archery volleys, but the Reach forces quickly demonstrated their tactical sophistication by coordinating their infantry and cavalry in ways that maximized their numerical superiority. Rather than simply charging forward in hopes of overwhelming the rebel positions, they conducted a methodical advance that steadily compressed Robert's battle line, while preventing him from using the mobility that had proven so effective at Summerhall. Lord Catherine, who had survived earlier battles to become one of Robert's most trusted commanders, died in the early stages of the fighting when a Tyrell cavalry charge broke through the rebel left flank. His death sent shockwaves through the Stormlands contingent, as men who had followed him for years suddenly found themselves leaderless in the midst of a deteriorating tactical situation. Lord Grandison fell shortly thereafter, his banner trampled underfoot as Reach infantry overwhelmed his position through sheer weight of numbers. The loss of two experienced commanders in rapid succession began to affect rebel morale in ways that even Robert's personal prowess could not counteract. Soldiers who had believed themselves invincible after Summerhall discovered that courage and determination were not always sufficient against superior numbers and better positioning. Robert himself fought with the same furious intensity that had made him legendary, his warhammer cutting through enemy ranks with mechanical precision, while his voice carried across the battlefield, urging his men forward despite the increasingly desperate nature of their situation. But even his superhuman efforts could not prevent the steady erosion of his army's cohesion as casualties mounted and key positions fell to enemy assault. The retreat from Ashford was a masterpiece of military discipline under the most adverse circumstances imaginable. Robert's remaining commanders managed to extract the majority of their forces from what could easily have become a complete massacre, but the cost was enormous in terms of both casualties and morale. The army that had seemed invincible after Summerhall limped away from the Reach bloodied and demoralized, its confidence shattered by the reality of facing a competent enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority. More seriously for Robert personally, he had sustained a significant wound during the fighting, a deep gash in his thigh that refused to heal properly despite the ministrations of his army's maesters. The injury slowed his movements and caused constant pain, but more dangerously, it began to show signs of infection that could prove fatal if not properly treated. The young lord who had seemed unstoppable was suddenly revealed to be as mortal as any other man bleeding on a battlefield. The retreat led the battered rebel army to Stony Sept, a substantial town in the northern Riverlands that offered the possibility of rest and resupply while remaining within friendly territory. The town's sept, built of grey stone that gave the settlement its name, had served as a place of refuge for travelers and pilgrims for centuries, its walls thick enough to provide genuine protection against raiders and its stores sufficient to sustain a modest force for an extended period. Robert's condition deteriorated rapidly once the army reached Stony Sept, his wound becoming infected despite all efforts to clean and treat it properly. Fever consumed him, leaving the rebellion's most charismatic leader delirious and near death, while his enemies closed in from multiple directions. The common folk of Stony Sept, moved by compassion for the wounded lord, and perhaps sensing an opportunity to aid a cause that might ultimately benefit them, opened their doors to provide shelter and care for the man they had begun calling their king. John Connington's arrival outside Stony Sept represented King Aerys's attempt to end the rebellion through a single decisive stroke. The Lord of Griffin's Roost was everything that Robert was not, a careful, methodical commander who approached warfare as an intellectual exercise requiring patience and precise planning rather than raw courage and overwhelming force. His reputation for tactical brilliance was well established throughout the Seven Kingdoms, and his loyalty to the crown had never been questioned despite the growing madness of the king he served. Connington's strategy for capturing Robert was characteristically sophisticated, involving a systematic search of every building in Stony Sept rather than a direct assault that might allow his target to escape in the confusion of battle. The Han's forces surrounded the town and began a methodical sweep, going house by house and street by street in search of the wounded rebel leader who represented such a threat to Targaryen rule. The search revealed something that Connington had not anticipated: the depth of support that Robert had gained among the common people of Westeros. Merchants, craftsmen serving women and laborers, who had no personal stake in the political disputes between great houses, risked their lives to protect a man they viewed as a champion of justice against tyranny. They provided false information to searching soldiers, concealed evidence of Robert's presence, and actively worked to frustrate the royal forces' attempts to locate their quarry. This popular support reflected a fundamental shift in the nature of the rebellion that even its leaders had not fully recognized. What had begun as a conflict between noble houses over matters of honor and political power had evolved into something approaching a popular uprising against the cruelties and excesses of Targaryen rule. The common folk who sheltered Robert in Stony Sept were not motivated by abstract concepts of feudal loyalty, but by their own experiences of royal justice and their hopes for something better. Ned Stark's arrival with reinforcements from the north transformed the tactical situation completely, catching Connington's forces by surprise and forcing them into a running battle through the streets of Stony Sept itself. The sound of church bells ringing out across the town gave this engagement its popular name, the Battle of the Bells, while marking another crucial victory for the rebel cause. The fighting that followed was unlike anything that had occurred previously in the rebellion, as organized military units clashed in an urban environment that favored mobility and individual initiative over formal tactics and numerical superiority. Ned's Northerners, hardened by constant warfare against wildling raiders and accustomed to fighting in adverse conditions, proved particularly effective in this confused melee, where victory went to those who could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Hoster Tully's decision to join the battle with forces from the Riverlands represented the formal entry of another great house into the rebellion, but more importantly, it demonstrated the political consequences of Connington's failure to capture Robert quickly and decisively. Houses that had remained neutral, while the rebellion's success remained uncertain, began to declare their allegiances as it became apparent that the royal forces could not guarantee victory even against isolated rebel armies. Connington's retreat from Stony Sept marked the end of his career as a royal commander, as King Aerys's reaction to the defeat was characteristically extreme and counterproductive. Rather than analyzing the tactical and strategic factors that had contributed to the failure, the Mad King focused his rage on what he perceived as personal betrayal, exiling one of his most competent military leaders for failing to achieve an objective that may have been impossible under the circumstances. The political implications of this decision extended far beyond the immediate military situation. By punishing failure with exile, Rather than attempting to learn from setbacks, Aerys demonstrated once again his fundamental unfitness for leadership during a crisis that required careful judgment and strategic thinking. Competent commanders throughout the royal forces began to question whether they could serve a king who would sacrifice their careers for temporary political advantage. Robert's recovery from his wounds became a symbol of the rebellion's resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The young lord, who had nearly died in Stony Sept, emerged from his ordeal stronger and more determined than ever, his brush with mortality having stripped away the last vestiges of youthful recklessness that had contributed to the defeat at Ashford. The man who rode out of Stony Sept was no longer the pleasure-loving young lord who had begun this rebellion, but a seasoned commander worthy of the crown he sought to claim. The Battle of the Bells also marked the effective end of royal control over the Riverlands, as House Tully's entry into the rebellion brought with it the allegiance of dozens of smaller houses that controlled the river crossings and agricultural centers essential to any military campaign in central Westeros. The strategic implications were enormous, as the Crown's forces suddenly found themselves cut off from each other and unable to coordinate their movements effectively. Most importantly, the common folk's protection of Robert in Stony Sept revealed the depth of popular dissatisfaction with Targaryen rule that extended far beyond the grievances of great houses. The rebellion had gained a moral authority that would prove just as valuable as military victories in the campaigns to come, transforming what might have remained a dynastic dispute into a genuine movement for change throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Victory at Stony Sept had transformed the rebellion from a desperate struggle for survival into a genuine threat to Targaryen rule. But Robert Baratheon understood that military success alone would not be sufficient to sustain his cause through the longer campaign that lay ahead. The great houses of Westeros had been bound together for centuries through a complex web of marriages, oaths, and mutual obligations that formed the backbone of feudal society. If the rebellion was to succeed, it would need to create its own network of alliances strong enough to compete with the ancient loyalties that still bound much of the realm to the Iron Throne. Hoster Tully had proven himself a shrewd negotiator during the crisis at Stony Sept, but his support for the rebel cause came with conditions that reflected the harsh realities of wartime politics. The Lord of Riverrun possessed 2 unmarried daughters, and he intended to use them as the foundation for marriage alliances that would cement the bonds between the great houses that had chosen to stand against King Aerys. These were not romantic matches born of affection or mutual attraction, but calculated political unions designed to create blood ties that would endure long after the current conflict had ended. The elder daughter, Catelyn, had originally been promised to Brandon Stark as part of Lord Rickard's grand strategy for building what the Maesters called the Southron ambitions. Brandon's death at the hands of the Mad King had technically ended that betrothal, but the political logic that had created it remained as compelling as ever. The North and the Riverlands shared borders and complementary resources, with the fertile river valleys providing grain that could feed northern armies, while the harsh Northlands offered warriors hardened by constant conflict with wildling raiders. Ned Stark's elevation to Lord of Winterfell, through tragedy rather than inheritance, had not altered his family's need for powerful allies, though it had certainly changed the personal dynamics involved in any potential marriage. Where Brandon had been fire and passion, quick to anger and equally quick to act, Ned was ice and contemplation, a man who measured his words carefully and considered the consequences of his actions before committing himself to any course. The match with Catelyn would serve the same strategic purposes that had motivated the original betrothal, but the personalities involved promised a very different kind of union. For Catelyn herself, the transition from one Stark brother to another represented both a profound personal loss and an acceptance of duty that defined noble marriages throughout Westeros. She had known Brandon since childhood, had grown to care for him during their betrothal, and had looked forward to a marriage that promised both political advantage and genuine affection. His brutal death had shattered those expectations, leaving her to contemplate a future with a man she barely knew, bound together by political necessity rather than personal choice. The wedding took place at Riverrun with all the ceremony that could be managed during wartime, though the circumstances inevitably cast a shadow over what should have been a joyous celebration. Catelyn wore a gown of Tully colors, blue and silver, that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the deep blue of her eyes, while Ned appeared in the gray and white of House Stark, his face solemn as he spoke, the ancient vows that would bind their houses together in peace and war. The bedding ceremony that followed represented one of the more archaic traditions of Westerosi noble culture, a ritual designed to ensure that marriages were properly consummated and therefore legally binding under both secular and religious law. Lords and ladies who had known both bride and groom since childhood participated in the symbolic removal of wedding garments, their laughter and crude jokes a stark contrast to the gravity of the political alliance being formalized through this most intimate of human connections. What passed between Ned and Catelyn in the privacy of their wedding chamber would remain their secret, but those who observed them in the days that followed noted a growing respect and affection that suggested their union might develop into something deeper than mere political convenience. Ned's natural courtesy and quiet strength appealed to a woman who had grown up surrounded by the rough masculinity of Riverland warriors, while Catelyn's intelligence and grace provided exactly the kind of partnership that a man thrust unexpectedly into lordship would need to succeed. The second marriage alliance proved even more controversial, as it involved the union of Jon Arryn, a man in his 60s, with Lysa Tully, a girl barely past her 15th day. The age difference was significant, even by the standards of a society that routinely arranged marriages between much older men and teenage brides. But the political logic was undeniable. Jon Arryn controlled the Vale, the most defensible of the Seven Kingdoms, while his advanced age meant that any sons born to this union would inherit one of the realm's most powerful lordships while still young enough to be influenced by their Tully relatives. Lysa herself was everything that her older sister was not: delicate where Catelyn was strong, emotional where her sister was controlled, prone to flights of fancy that sometimes bordered on hysteria. The prospect of marriage to an elderly lord she had met only a handful of times clearly terrified her, but the girl understood her duty well enough to go through with the ceremony, despite her obvious reluctance. The wedding feast at Riverrun became an impromptu war council as the newly allied houses planned their strategy for the campaigns to come. Robert's victory at Stony Sept had demonstrated the rebellion's military potential, but everyone present understood that much harder fighting lay ahead. The Crown still controlled King's Landing and the royal treasury, while powerful houses like the Tyrells and Martells remained loyal to the Targaryen dynasty. More troubling was the continued absence of any word regarding Lyanna Stark's fate. Robert's motivation for joining the rebellion remained deeply personal, driven by his determination to rescue the woman he loved from whatever fate had befallen her in Prince Rhaegar's company. The uncertainty surrounding her situation added an emotional urgency to the conflict that complemented the political and military considerations driving the various noble houses to risk everything in opposition to their anointed king. Petyr Baelish's presence at these celebrations represented a footnote to history that would gain significance only in hindsight. The young heir to a minor house in the Fingers had been fostered at Riverrun since childhood, developing what he believed was a deep romantic attachment to Catelyn Tully that had culminated in his challenging Brandon Stark to single combat for her hand. The duel had been brief and utterly one-sided, with Brandon's superior size and skill leaving Petyr bloodied and humiliated, while demonstrating the vast gulf between his romantic fantasies and political reality. The defeat had marked the effective end of Petyr's childhood, transforming a boy who had believed that love could conquer all obstacles into a young man who understood that power came through cunning and manipulation rather than noble gestures or heartfelt declarations. His presence at the wedding celebrations gave him a front-row seat to witness how marriages were actually arranged among the great houses, lessons that would shape his approach to politics and personal relationships for decades to come. The military preparations that accompanied these political arrangements revealed the true scope of the challenge facing the rebellion. Robert's army, reinforced by troops from the north and riverlands, now numbered close to 30,000 men, a formidable force by any standard but still smaller than what the crown could theoretically field. If all its loyal houses answered the call to arms, victory would require not just courage and skill, but also careful strategy and more than a little luck. The logistical challenges alone were staggering, as feeding and equipping such a large army required resources that strained the rebellion's finances to their limits. The riverlands were fertile and productive, but they were also the likely battleground for much of the fighting to come, meaning that the very lands that provided the rebellion's sustenance would be devastated by the armies marching across them. Jon Arryn's experience as both a military commander and administrator proved invaluable during these preparations, as the elderly Lord of the Vale possessed both the strategic vision and practical knowledge necessary to transform a collection of regional forces into a unified army capable of challenging the crown. His relationships with the various lords and their retainers helped smooth over the inevitable disputes that arose when proud men were forced to subordinate their personal ambitions to the greater good of the rebellion. The weapons and armor required for such a large force represented another significant challenge, as the rebellion could not rely on the royal armories that equipped loyalist forces. Smiths throughout the Allied territories worked day and night to produce the steel that would be needed for the battles ahead, while existing stockpiles were carefully inventoried and distributed according to strategic priorities rather than traditional hierarchies. Perhaps most importantly, the alliance forged through these marriages created a framework for cooperation that extended beyond the immediate military crisis. The children born to these unions would inherit not just titles and lands, but also the relationships and obligations that would shape the realm's political landscape for generations to come. The rebellion was not just fighting to remove a mad king, but to create a new order that would prove more stable and just than what it replaced. As winter deepened, and the armies prepared for the campaigns that would decide the fate of the Seven Kingdoms, the great alliance that had been forged through blood, marriage, and shared sacrifice represented something unprecedented in Westerosi history. Never before had so many powerful houses united in opposition to Targaryen rule, and never before had the stakes been so high for everyone involved. The Game of Thrones had entered its most dangerous phase, where a single mistake could doom not just individual players but entire bloodlines to extinction. The alliances that had been forged in the fires of rebellion would soon be tested in the crucible of battle, where the difference between victory and defeat would determine whether the realm's future would be shaped by justice or madness. The Trident had served as the crossroads of Westeros for millennia, its three great rivers carrying trade and travelers from every corner of the realm, while their fertile banks supported some of the most productive farmland in the Seven Kingdoms. Now, in the early months of 283 AC, this ancient highway would become the stage for the most consequential battle in the history of the realm, a confrontation that would determine not just who sat the Iron Throne, but what kind of kingdom would emerge from the ashes of civil war. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen's return to the conflict represented a fundamental shift in the crown's strategy and capabilities. For nearly a year, the Dragon Prince had remained absent from the war that bore his name, his whereabouts unknown to all but a select few, while his alleged kidnapping of Lyanna Stark provided the emotional fuel that drove the rebellion forward. His sudden reappearance at the head of a royal army suggested that whatever business had kept him away was now concluded, though the nature of that business remained as mysterious as ever. The prince who rode north from King's Landing bore little resemblance to the melancholy harp player who had shocked the realm at Harrenhal's tournament. Gone was the scholarly introspection that had marked his youth, replaced by a grim determination that spoke to terrible choices made and accepted. His silver hair was tied back for battle, his purple eyes focused on horizons that seemed to hold visions invisible to others, and his bearing carried the weight of a man who believed himself to be fulfilling prophecy itself. Rhaegar's army numbered 40,000 men, drawn from the Crownlands, parts of the Reach that remained loyal to the crown, and contingents of sellswords purchased with gold from the royal treasury. This was the largest force that the Targaryens had assembled since the rebellion began, a demonstration of the dynasty's determination to end the uprising through overwhelming military superiority, rather than the gradual attrition that had characterized earlier campaigns. More significantly, the prince had convinced several houses that had remained neutral to join his cause, their lords swayed by a combination of traditional loyalty to the crown and fear of what defeat might mean for their own futures. The sight of the last dragon riding at the head of such a mighty host reminded many of the realm's nobles why the Targaryens had ruled for 3 centuries, their very presence on the battlefield serving as a symbol of legitimacy that no pretender could match. The rebel army that marched to meet this royal host represented the culmination of months of careful planning and political maneuvering. Robert Baratheon commanded 35,000 men, a force that included hardened veterans from his earlier victories, alongside fresh levies from the great houses that had committed themselves to his cause. The difference in numbers was significant but not overwhelming, particularly given the rebels' advantages in leadership and motivation. Ned Stark led the largest single contingent, nearly 12,000 Northerners whose loyalty to their young lord had been forged through generations of shared hardship and mutual dependence. These were men accustomed to fighting against impossible odds, whether against wildling raiders beyond the wall or the harsh winters that regularly tested their endurance and resolve. Their weapons might be simpler than those carried by southern knights, but their discipline and courage had been proven in countless battles against enemies who showed no mercy to the defeated. Jon Arryn's contribution came primarily in the form of heavy cavalry from the Vale, knights whose horses and armor represented the finest military equipment that Westerosi craftsmanship could produce. These men had trained for war their entire lives, studying the classic texts of military strategy while honing their skills in tournaments and mock battles that prepared them for exactly this kind of large-scale engagement. Hoster Tully's Riverland forces provided the mobility and local knowledge that would prove crucial in a campaign fought across their ancestral territories. These soldiers understood every ford and bridge, every village and crossroads that might influence the battle's outcome, while their boats controlled the waterways that could determine which army received supplies and reinforcements. Robert himself had evolved significantly since the early days of the rebellion. The young lord who had relied primarily on personal prowess and instinctive courage transformed into a genuine military commander capable of coordinating complex operations involving multiple armies. His warhammer remained his preferred weapon, but he now wielded strategy and diplomacy with equal skill, understanding that victory required more than individual heroics. The intelligence gathering that preceded the battle revealed important details about both armies' strengths and weaknesses. The royal forces included significant numbers of fresh troops who had not yet experienced the psychological shock of facing rebel veterans, but they also contained units whose loyalty remained questionable despite their formal allegiance to the crown. Several lords had answered Prince Rhaegar's call with notable reluctance, their soldiers reflecting their commander's ambivalence about the justice of the cause they served. Conversely, the rebel army suffered from the accumulated fatigue of a year spent in almost constant campaign, with many units having participated in multiple battles while rarely enjoying extended periods of rest and recuperation. However, this experience had created a cohesion and mutual trust that could not be purchased with gold or commanded through threats, bonds forged in shared danger that made each soldier willing to risk his life for his comrades. The strategic situation surrounding the Trident reflected broader political realities that would influence the battle's outcome, regardless of tactical considerations. Both armies understood that this engagement would likely prove decisive, with the victor gaining momentum that could carry them to ultimate victory, while the defeated faced potential annihilation rather than mere tactical setback. For the rebels, defeat would mean the effective end of their cause, as the loss of their main army would leave the individual kingdoms vulnerable to royal retaliation, while eliminating the military leadership that had held the alliance together. Robert's death or capture would remove the charismatic figure around whom the rebellion had coalesced, while losses among the other great lords would cripple their house's ability to continue resistance. The stakes for the royal forces were equally high, though perhaps less immediately apparent. Prince Rhaegar's personal reputation and the dynasty's prestige had been invested in this campaign, making failure tantamount to admitting that Targaryen rule had lost the divine favor that justified absolute monarchy. A defeat here would encourage further rebellions while undermining the loyalty of houses that had remained neutral or reluctantly supportive of the crown. The psychological dimensions of the coming battle extended beyond military considerations to touch fundamental questions about the nature of kingship and legitimate authority. Prince Rhaegar represented the ancient bloodline that had conquered Westeros through fire and blood, his very presence on the battlefield serving as a reminder of the dragons that had once made Targaryen rule unchallengeable. His opponent was a self-made king, whose claim rested on nothing more than the strength of his arm and the justice of his cause. Weather conditions in the days leading up to the battle favored neither side particularly, with spring rains making the ground muddy and treacherous while swelling the Trident's tributaries beyond their normal bounds. These conditions would limit the effectiveness of heavy cavalry while making coordination between different parts of each army more difficult, factors that might favor the rebels' more experienced commanders and disciplined infantry. The Ruby Ford that would give its name to the battle had served as a crossing point for armies and merchants for thousands of years, its shallow waters and firm bottom making it one of the few places where large forces could traverse the river safely. Both commanders understood the strategic importance of controlling this crossing, as whoever held the ford would determine when and how the battle commenced. Prince Rhaegar's decision to position his army on the south bank of the Trident reflected both confidence in his force's superior numbers and a desire to force the rebels to attack across the water, where they would be vulnerable during the crossing. This defensive strategy made tactical sense but also ceded the initiative to Robert, allowing the rebel commander to choose the timing and nature of the engagement. The night before battle brought the traditional rituals that soldiers had observed for millennia, prayers to various gods for protection and victory mixed with more practical preparations like sharpening weapons and checking armor for weaknesses. Veterans shared advice with nervous recruits, while commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans, though everyone understood that no strategy survived contact with the enemy unchanged. Individual soldiers on both sides grappled with the knowledge that tomorrow might be their last day alive, some finding comfort in thoughts of home and family, while others focused on the martial skills that had brought them to this moment. The camaraderie forged through shared hardship and mutual dependence provided emotional support that formal military discipline could never match, bonds between men who trusted each other with their lives. Prince Rhaegar spent the evening in contemplation, his thoughts focused on prophecies and possibilities that had driven him to actions that even his closest supporters struggled to understand. The weight of destiny pressed down on him like physical armor, the knowledge that his choices had set in motion events that would reshape the world according to visions that might prove either divinely inspired or tragically mistaken. Robert's final preparations were characteristically direct and practical, ensuring that his weapon was properly balanced and his armor fitted correctly, while sharing final words with commanders who had become brothers through months of shared struggle. His thoughts inevitably turned to Lyanna, the woman whose fate had provided the personal motivation for everything that had followed, her image serving as both inspiration and torment. As dawn approached over the Trident, both armies stirred with the nervous energy that preceded great battles, soldiers checking equipment one final time, while officers made last-minute adjustments to formations and tactics. The morning mist that rose from the river's surface would soon be joined by the smoke of 1,000 cooking fires as men ate what might be their final meal, the ordinary human needs for food and warmth, persisting even in the shadow of imminent violence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the immediate fate of the rebellion, but the long-term trajectory of Westerosi civilization. 3 centuries of Targaryen rule would be either validated or repudiated by the events of the coming day, while the future of every soul in the 7 kingdoms hung in the balance of a battle that would be remembered as long as men told stories of kings and dragons, wolves and stags, and the moment when the wheel of history turned toward an uncertain but inevitable future. Dawn broke over the Trident like a sword blade cutting through silk, its pale light revealing 2 armies separated by waters that had run clear for 1,000 years, but would soon be stained crimson with the blood of kings and commoners alike. The morning mist clung to the river's surface as if reluctant to witness what was about to unfold, but the rising sun burned away these final veils to expose the greatest military spectacle in the history of the 7 kingdoms. Prince Rhaegar's forces had arrayed themselves in the classical formation favored by Targaryen commanders since the conquest, their center anchored by heavy infantry, while cavalry units protected the flanks and maintained reserves for crucial moments in the battle. The dragon banners that flew above their ranks caught the morning breeze like living things, black dragons on red fields that had struck fear into the hearts of enemies for 3 centuries of unbroken rule. Robert's army presented a starker but no less impressive sight, their battle line stretching along the northern bank of the Trident, in formations that reflected the diverse military traditions of the rebel alliance. Northern spearmen stood shoulder to shoulder with Vale Knights, their equipment simpler, but their discipline forged through years of warfare against enemies who granted no quarter to the defeated. The direwolf, falcon and trout banners that marked their positions spoke to a unity of purpose that transcended regional differences and ancient rivalries. The battle began not with grand charges or dramatic gestures, but with the methodical exchange of archery volleys that had opened conflicts for millennia. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky as both sides sought to thin their opponents' ranks before the real killing began, their points finding gaps in armor and shields while creating a deadly rain that forced soldiers to huddle behind whatever protection they could find. The sound of arrows striking wood and steel created a percussion that echoed across the battlefield like hail on a metal roof, punctuated by the screams of men and horses as barbed points found their marks. Casualties began mounting immediately, though neither side gained a decisive advantage during this preliminary phase of the engagement. Robert himself had positioned his forces to take maximum advantage of the ford's geography, understanding that whoever controlled the crossing would determine the battle's flow and outcome. His strategy required patience rather than the immediate gratification of personal combat, a discipline that would have seemed impossible in the young lord who had begun this rebellion driven by rage and grief. Prince Rhaegar's response demonstrated the tactical sophistication that had made him dangerous despite his reputation as a scholarly dreamer. Rather than attempting to force the crossing immediately, he conducted a careful probing action designed to identify weaknesses in the rebel formation while preserving his own force's strength for the decisive moment that would determine victory or defeat. The first major clash came when royal cavalry attempted to cross the ford in formation, their heavy horse intended to establish a bridgehead on the northern bank that could be exploited by following waves of infantry. The sight was magnificent and terrible, hundreds of armored knights spurring their destriers through the flowing water, while rebel archers concentrated their fire on the narrow crossing point. The slaughter that followed demonstrated why river crossings had been considered among the most dangerous military operations since warfare began. Horses stumbled and fell in the treacherous footing, while their riders struggled to maintain formation under concentrated missile fire, the water around them turning red as arrows found their marks with increasing frequency. Yet some of the royal cavalry managed to reach the northern bank, where they found themselves facing northern spearmen who had been preparing for exactly this moment. The collision between charging horsemen and disciplined infantry created a sound like thunder, followed by the screams of dying men and animals as steel points punched through armor and into the flesh beneath. The melee that developed along the riverbank became a microcosm of the larger battle, with individual acts of heroism and cowardice playing out against a backdrop of organized violence that defied any attempt at overall comprehension. Knights who had trained their entire lives for this moment found themselves facing common soldiers whose only advantages were desperation and superior numbers, while noble bloodlines that had endured for centuries ended in anonymous heaps of bodies beside the flowing water. Robert's tactical masterstroke came when he committed his reserves not to reinforce the riverbank fighting, but to strike at the royal force's eastern flank, where the terrain favored mobility over the heavy formations that dominated the center of the battlefield. This maneuver forced Prince Rhaegar to respond with his own reserves, creating a running battle that stretched for miles along the Trident's banks. The fighting that followed tested every participant's endurance and resolve as the battle devolved into a series of smaller engagements where victory went to whichever side could maintain unit cohesion while adapting to rapidly changing tactical situations. Veterans who had survived multiple battles found themselves in combat more intense than anything they had previously experienced, while new recruits discovered whether months of training had prepared them for the reality of facing death with weapon in hand. Prince Rhaegar himself remained with the royal center, his presence serving as both tactical reserve and psychological anchor for forces that might otherwise have broken under the pressure of sustained combat. His black armor gleamed like liquid shadow in the morning light, while the rubies that decorated his breastplate caught the sun like drops of blood that had somehow been transformed into precious stones. The prince's tactical awareness was evident in his careful management of resources throughout the battle's early phases, avoiding the temptation to commit prematurely while maintaining the flexibility necessary to respond to Robert's increasingly aggressive tactics. His reputation as a dreamer and scholar had never extended to questions about his personal courage, but few had expected the level of military competence he displayed when crisis demanded decisive leadership. Robert Baratheon's approach to the battle reflected both his personal nature and the strategic requirements of his position, combining the direct aggression that had made him legendary with the calculated thinking that successful rebellion required. His war hammer remained at his side rather than in his hands during the battle's early phases, the weapon's symbolic power perhaps more valuable than its physical capabilities during moments when inspiration mattered more than individual prowess. The turning point came when the accumulated pressure of continuous fighting began to tell on both armies' cohesion and morale. Units that had maintained perfect formation during the battle's opening phases started to show signs of fatigue and confusion as casualties mounted, and the fog of war obscured tactical situations that had seemed clear at dawn. It was at this crucial moment that Prince Rhaegar made his most significant tactical decision, choosing to lead a personal charge across the ford rather than continuing to direct the battle from a position of relative safety. His reasons for this choice would be debated by military scholars for generations, but the immediate effect was to transform what had been a methodical engagement into something approaching a medieval version of single combat between champions. The sight of the last dragon spurring his destrier through the Ruby Ford galvanized both armies, royal forces surging forward in support of their prince, while rebels prepared to meet the charge that would determine their fate. The water seemed to part before Rhaegar's advance, as if the river itself recognized the significance of what was about to occur. Robert's response was immediate and characteristic, the young rebel king abandoning his position of command to meet his greatest enemy in personal combat. His war hammer appeared in his hands as if summoned by magic, its massive head gleaming with the morning light, while he urged his own horse toward the ford, where destiny waited with a dragon's face. The two champions met in the center of the Ruby Ford, their collision creating a sound that carried across the battlefield despite the cacophony of 10,000 other individual fights. Time seemed suspended as noble and common soldier alike paused to witness the duel that would determine not just the battle's outcome, but the future of the Seven Kingdoms. Prince Rhaegar fought with the fluid grace that had made him renowned in tournaments throughout the realm, his swordwork displaying the technical perfection that came from years of dedicated practice under the finest masters available to Targaryen princes. His blade seemed to dance around Robert's more direct attacks, seeking the gaps in armor that would allow a killing thrust while avoiding the crushing blows that the warhammer could deliver. Robert's style was everything that Rhaegar's was not, relying on overwhelming power and aggressive tactics rather than finesse and technique. His warhammer moved like a force of nature, each swing capable of ending the fight instantly if it connected with sufficient force, while his sheer physical presence seemed to dominate the space around the two combatants. The duel's conclusion came with shocking suddenness, Robert's hammer finding its mark just as Rhaegar's sword sought a gap in the rebel king's armor. The sound of the impact echoed across the battlefield like a thunderclap, followed by silence as both armies absorbed the implications of what they had witnessed. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the last dragon, lay dying in the ruby ford, his life's blood mixing with the river water, while the rubies from his armor scattered like drops of crystallized flame across the stream bed. The sight of their prince's fall sent shockwaves through the royal army that no amount of tactical preparation could have anticipated or countered. Robert stood over his fallen enemy, his war hammer dripping with the blood of kings while he surveyed a battlefield that had been transformed by a single moment of decisive action. The young lord who had begun this rebellion in grief and rage had become something else entirely, a figure of such imposing presence that even veteran soldiers felt compelled to avert their eyes. The royal army's collapse began immediately, starting with individual soldiers who broke ranks to flee the field and spreading like wildfire through formations that had seemed unbreakable moments before. The death of Prince Rhaegar had removed not just their tactical commander, but the symbol of Targaryen legitimacy that had sustained their cause through months of increasingly desperate warfare. The pursuit that followed was both necessary and horrible, as rebel forces hunted down fleeing enemies while trying to maintain enough discipline to prevent the complete breakdown of military order. Thousands of royal soldiers died during the rout, cut down while attempting to escape rather than during the formal battle that had preceded their flight. By midday, the Battle of the Trident was over, leaving the rebel forces in complete control of the field, while the scattered remnants of the royal army fled toward King's Landing in whatever formations they could maintain. The cost had been enormous on both sides, with casualty lists that would devastate noble houses throughout the realm. But the strategic implications were clear to everyone who had witnessed the fighting. Robert Baratheon had won more than a military victory. He had claimed the moral authority that came with defeating the Targaryen prince in single combat, while demonstrating that courage and justice could triumph over ancient bloodlines and dynastic privilege. The road to King's Landing now lay open, guarded only by whatever forces the Mad King could assemble from the ruins of his son's army. Victory at the Trident had shattered the last organized resistance to Robert's rebellion, but the young king faced a race against time that would test his strategic judgment as severely as any battlefield confrontation. King's Landing lay exposed, its defenses weakened by the destruction of Prince Rhaegar's army, yet the capital still contained threats that could transform military victory into political disaster if not handled with extraordinary care and speed. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the complex challenges that accompanied triumph on such a scale. Thousands of wounded soldiers from both armies required medical attention that strained the rebellion's resources, while the disposal of bodies threatened to create disease that could devastate the survivors. More pressing from a strategic standpoint was the need to maintain army cohesion, while pursuing fleeing enemies who might regroup if given sufficient time to reorganize their scattered forces. Robert's Council of War, held in a blood-stained pavilion beside the Ruby Ford, brought together the military commanders whose decisions would determine whether the rebellion's greatest victory became the foundation for lasting success or merely a prelude to greater disasters. Jon Arryn's experience proved invaluable during these deliberations, as the elderly Lord of the Vale possessed both the strategic vision and political wisdom necessary to navigate the treacherous currents of a collapsing regime. The primary concern was Aerys himself, whose reaction to news of his son's death could not be predicted with any confidence. The Mad King's previous responses to military setbacks had been characterized by increasingly extreme violence against real and imagined enemies, while his obsession with wildfire had grown more pronounced with each passing month of the rebellion. Intelligence reports from the capital spoke of massive stockpiles of the volatile substance hidden throughout the city, enough to reduce King's Landing to ash and memory if the king decided that destruction was preferable to surrender. Ned Stark advocated for immediate pursuit, arguing that speed was essential to prevent Aerys from implementing whatever desperate schemes his paranoid mind might devise. The Lord of Winterfell had witnessed the Mad King's capacity for cruelty firsthand through his father and brother's murders, and he understood that mercy was not a concept that existed in the royal vocabulary when faced with defeat and humiliation. However, the army's condition complicated any attempt at rapid movement toward the capital. Many units had suffered significant casualties during the battle, while others were scattered across miles of battlefield pursuing enemies or securing prisoners. The logistics of feeding and supplying 30,000 men during a forced march would strain resources that were already stretched thin after months of continuous campaigning. More troubling was the absence of any reliable intelligence about the situation within King's Landing itself. The royal court had been effectively sealed off from outside contact since the rebellion began, with Aerys' paranoia making him suspicious of any messenger or raven that might carry information to his enemies. The rebels faced the possibility of marching into a trap with unknown numbers of defenders and defensive preparations that could negate their numerical superiority. The solution came from an unexpected source, as Lord Tywin Lannister's massive army appeared on the horizon like a golden tide flowing across the landscape. The Lord of Casterly Rock had remained conspicuously neutral throughout the rebellion, his 30,000 men representing the single largest uncommitted force in the Seven Kingdoms, while he waited to see which side would emerge victorious before declaring his allegiances. Tywin's decision to finally reveal his intentions created both opportunity and danger for the rebel cause. His army was fresh and well supplied, capable of reaching King's Landing far more quickly than Robert's battle-weary forces, but his motivations remained unclear even to those who knew him best. The Lord of Casterly Rock was nothing if not calculating, and his sudden appearance suggested that he had identified some advantage to be gained from the changing political situation. Robert's instinctive distrust of Tywin's motives was shared by most of his commanders, who understood that the Lannister Lord's reputation for ruthless pragmatism made him a dangerous ally, even when his interests aligned with their own. However, the strategic realities were undeniable. Tywin's forces could reach the capital days ahead of anyone else, potentially preventing Aerys from implementing whatever destructive schemes he had prepared for exactly this scenario. The negotiations that followed reveal the complex political calculations that would shape the realm's future long after the immediate military crisis had passed. Tywin demanded recognition of his family's loyalty to the new regime, along with assurances that his service would be rewarded with positions of power and influence commensurate with his contribution to Robert's ultimate victory. More significantly, Tywin insisted that his forces be allowed to enter King's Landing first, claiming that his men's discipline and experience made them better suited to securing the capital without unnecessary destruction or civilian casualties. This request raised obvious concerns about Tywin's true intentions, but the alternative was to allow Aerys additional time to prepare defenses or implement schemes that could prove far more costly than trusting the Lord of Casterly Rock's ambitions. Meanwhile, within King's Landing itself, The Mad King's reaction to news of the Trident exceeded even his supporters' worst fears about his mental state. Aerys had always been prone to paranoid episodes, but the death of his heir and the destruction of his army pushed him into realms of madness that defied rational comprehension. He raged through the Red Keep like a caged animal, seeing enemies and conspiracies in every shadow while demanding increasingly extreme measures to defend his crumbling kingdom. Queen Rhaegar and her infant son Viserys had already been dispatched to Dragonstone, the ancient Targaryen stronghold that might provide sanctuary if the capital fell to rebel forces. However, Princess Rhaegar and her children remained in the Red Keep, their presence serving as both hostages and symbols of the dynasty's continuity, despite the disasters that had befallen the royal family. Aerys's final solution to the rebellion's success revealed the depths of his madness and the genuine threat he posed to everyone within the capital's walls. If he could not rule the Seven Kingdoms, then no one would rule them. And if his enemies thought they could simply walk into his city and claim his throne, they would discover that King's Landing would become their tomb rather than their prize. The wildfire caches that had been accumulating throughout his reign were now positioned strategically throughout the city, hidden beneath major buildings and gathering places where their simultaneous detonation would create a firestorm that would consume everything within miles. The pyromancers, led by Wisdom Rossart, had prepared the greatest conflagration in human history, their green flames capable of reducing the realm's largest city to ash within hours. Aerys's plan was breathtaking in its scope and horrifying in its implications. Rather than face capture and trial, he would transform his capital into a funeral pyre that would take hundreds of thousands of innocent lives while demonstrating the ultimate expression of Targaryen power, the ability to destroy what they could not control. The only obstacle to this scheme's implementation was Ser Jaime Lannister, the youngest member of the Kingsguard and the sole witness to the king's final descent into genocidal madness. The golden-haired knight had sworn sacred oaths to protect his king's life and obey his commands, but those vows had never contemplated orders that would result in mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Jaime's internal struggle reflected broader questions about duty and honor that had defined the rebellion from its earliest days. Was loyalty to a lawful king absolute, regardless of his actions or mental state? Did the oaths of knighthood supersede moral obligations to protect innocent life? These were not abstract philosophical questions, but immediate practical dilemmas that required immediate resolution while the city's fate hung in the balance. The young knight's position was made more complex by his family connections to the approaching Lannister army, creating potential conflicts of interest that could be interpreted as treason, regardless of his ultimate decision. If he acted against the king, he would be branded a kingslayer for the rest of his life. If he remained passive, he would become complicit in the greatest atrocity in Westerosi history. Tywin Lannister's army reached King's Landing just as these internal conflicts were reaching their climax, the Golden Lions of Casterly Rock appearing outside the city's gates while desperate preparations continued within. The Lord of Casterly Rock's reputation preceded him, his known pragmatism and ruthlessness creating fear among defenders who understood that surrender might not guarantee merciful treatment. The gates of King's Landing opened to admit Tywin's forces. After minimal resistance, the city's remaining defenders either fleeing or switching sides rather than facing a siege they could not hope to win. However, what followed was not the orderly occupation that Tywin had promised, but a brutal sack that would stain his reputation and create political complications for years to come. Lannister soldiers poured through the streets like a golden flood, their discipline maintained just long enough to secure strategic objectives before dissolving into the kind of organized looting that followed the fall of major cities throughout history. The common people who had survived Aerys's tyranny now faced a different kind of terror as foreign soldiers claimed their city as the spoils of war. The assault on the Red Keep itself proceeded with methodical efficiency, Lannister forces overwhelming the token resistance offered by guards who had already lost faith in their king's cause. The throne room that had witnessed so many horrors during Aerys' reign would soon host its final and most significant act of violence, as the Mad King's plans for mass destruction approached their moment of implementation or prevention. In this crucible of competing loyalties and impossible choices, the fate of King's Landing and everyone within its walls would be decided by individuals whose decisions would echo through generations of Westerosi history. While the fate of King's Landing hung in the balance, and the realm celebrated Robert's ascension to the Iron Throne, Ned Stark found himself haunted by questions that would not rest with his brother's death or his king's victory. Lyanna remained missing, her fate unknown despite the collapse of Targaryen resistance and the capture of the capital. The mystery that had sparked the rebellion in the first place demanded resolution, yet the answers proved as elusive as smoke in the wind. The search for Lyanna had consumed Ned's thoughts throughout the war's final months, every victory bringing hope that the next castle taken or lord questioned might reveal her whereabouts. Intelligence gathered from prisoners and defectors painted contradictory pictures, some claiming she had been seen in Dawn, others insisting she had been smuggled across the narrow sea to the Free Cities, where Targaryen loyalists maintained safe houses for exactly such contingencies. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a servant who had fled the Tower of Joy in the Red Mountains of Dawn, carrying tales of 3 Kingsguard knights maintaining a vigil at what appeared to be an abandoned fortress. The woman spoke of strange sounds echoing from the tower's upper chambers, of supplies being brought regularly despite the apparent emptiness of the structure, and of visitors who came and went under cover of darkness. Sir Arthur Dayne, Sir Oswell Went, and Sir Gerald Hightower represented the finest knights the realm had ever produced, men whose loyalty to their oaths had become legendary throughout the 7 kingdoms. Their presence at an isolated tower in Dawn, far from the battles that had decided the realm's fate, suggested something far more significant than a simple military posting or routine assignment. The Tower of Joy itself had been built during the early years of Targaryen rule as a retreat for princes seeking solitude away from the political pressures of court life. Its remote location in the Red Mountains provided both spectacular views and complete privacy, while its modest size suggested intimate gatherings rather than the grand ceremonies that characterized royal residences in more populated areas. Ned's decision to investigate personally reflected both his methodical nature and his understanding that whatever secrets the tower held were too important to entrust to subordinates. The Lord of Winterfell selected 6 companions for this mission, each chosen for specific skills that might prove essential in whatever confrontation awaited them in the Dornish Mountains. Howland Reed brought the tracking abilities and guerrilla warfare expertise that had made the Crannogmen legendary throughout the North, his diminutive stature hiding combat skills that had been honed through years of fighting in the treacherous bogs and waterways of the Neck. His loyalty to House Stark was absolute, forged through shared hardship and mutual respect that transcended the social barriers normally separating great lords from their smaller bannermen. Sir Mark Ryswell and Sir Thea Wool represented the martial traditions of the North, knights whose swords had been blooded in numerous battles, yet who retained the practical wisdom that came from fighting enemies who granted no quarter to the defeated. Their presence provided both tactical expertise and the moral support that came from facing danger alongside men who had proven their courage under fire. Lord Dustin, Sir Ethan Glover, and Sir Martin Castle completed the party, each bringing unique capabilities while sharing the grim determination that had sustained the northern forces throughout the rebellion's darkest moments. These were not glory-seeking adventurers, but seasoned warriors who understood that duty sometimes required actions that offered no hope of reward or recognition. The journey to the Tower of Joy took them through some of the most inhospitable terrain in Westeros, the Red Mountains, living up to their name through a combination of scorching heat and jagged stone that tested both men and horses to their limits. The landscape seemed designed by hostile gods to punish intruders, its beauty marred by the constant threat of dehydration, exposure, and falls that could cripple or kill the unwary. As they approached their destination, Ned's party encountered increasing signs that the tower was indeed occupied, though by how many people and for what purpose remained unclear. Tracks in the sand suggested regular movement between the structure and nearby settlements, while the presence of fresh supplies indicated that whoever controlled the tower had maintained contact with the outside world despite the war's chaos. The Tower of Joy appeared on the horizon like a fever dream, its pale stones shimmering in the desert heat, while red mountains provided a backdrop that seemed painted in blood. The structure's elegant lines spoke to Targaryen aesthetic sensibilities, its beauty unmarred by the practical concerns that dominated military architecture elsewhere in the realm. 3 figures waited outside the tower's entrance, their white cloaks marking them as members of the Kingsguard, despite their location hundreds of miles from any king they might reasonably be expected to protect. Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, stood at their center, his legendary blade Dawn catching the sunlight like a piece of fallen star given deadly form. The confrontation that followed would be remembered as one of the most significant in Westerosi history, though few would ever know the full truth of what transpired in those crucial moments. Ned's attempt to negotiate revealed the fundamental impossibility of peaceful resolution, as both sides understood that their duties were irreconcilable despite mutual respect and shared codes of honor. Arthur Dayne's explanation was simple yet profound in its implications. They had sworn oaths to protect those under their care, vows that superseded political changes or military defeats. The rebellion's success had not released them from obligations that transcended individual kings or kingdoms, duties that would endure until death claimed them or their charges released them from service. Ned's response reflected both his understanding of knightly honor and his determination to uncover the truth about his sister's fate. He had not traveled across half the continent to be turned away by appeals to duty, no matter how sincerely offered or how much he respected the men making them. If the Kingsguard barred his path, then blood would be spilled regardless of personal feelings or mutual admiration. The battle that erupted between these 7 exceptional warriors represented perhaps the highest expression of martial skill ever witnessed in the realm. Each participant was a master of weapons and tactics, their abilities honed through years of training and combat that had elevated them far above ordinary knights. The dance of steel that followed would have been beautiful if it had not been so deadly, each movement flowing into the next with lethal precision. Arthur Dayne fought like a god of war given human form, his swordwork displaying a perfection that seemed to transcend mortal limitations. Dawn moved in his hands like living light, its blade finding gaps in armor and guard that lesser swords could never exploit while defending against attacks that would have overwhelmed anyone else. The Northern Knights matched the Kingsguard's individual brilliance with teamwork and determination that reflected their shared experiences in countless battles. They fought not as separate warriors but as parts of a greater whole, each man's actions coordinated with his companion's movements in ways that multiplied their collective effectiveness. The melee's outcome was decided by the smallest of margins, individual moments of luck or skill that determined who lived and who died in a contest where victory meant survival and defeat meant death. Howland Reed's intervention at the crucial moment preserved Ned's life, though the nature of that assistance would remain a mystery that the diminutive Crannogman would carry to his grave. When the killing finally ended, only Ned and Howland remained alive among the 7 men who had fought with such skill and courage. The greatest knights of their generation lay dead in the sand, their blood seeping into ground that had witnessed the end of an era as surely as any battlefield where armies clashed in formal combat. The tower's interior revealed secrets that would haunt Ned Stark for the remainder of his days, truths that challenged everything he thought he understood about duty, honor, and the prices that noble intentions sometimes demanded. In a chamber that smelled of blood and roses, he found his sister Lyanna, but not in the circumstances he had expected or hoped. Lyanna lay dying from complications that had claimed so many women throughout history, her strength ebbing away despite the care she had received from those who had tended her during her final months. The beauty that had sparked a war was still visible in her pale features, but it was the beauty of winter roses touched by frost, delicate and ethereal yet marked by approaching dissolution. Her final words to Ned carried weight that would reshape his understanding of honor and responsibility. The promise she extracted from him was not the simple request of a dying sister, but a burden that would test his integrity in ways he could never have anticipated. The secret she shared would force him to choose between the truth that might bring justice and the lie that could preserve innocent life. The infant she pressed into his arms represented possibilities and dangers that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of their meeting. This was not merely Lyanna's child, but a living embodiment of the forces that had torn the realm apart, blood that carried within it the potential for future conflicts or reconciliation depending on how carefully its existence was managed. Ned's decision to claim the child as his own bastard son represented perhaps the greatest sacrifice of his life, the voluntary destruction of his reputation for honesty in service of a greater good that only he could fully understand. The man who had built his identity around unwavering truthfulness would spend the rest of his days living a lie, protecting a secret that could save or damn the realm depending on who learned it and how they chose to use the knowledge. The name he gave the boy, Jon Snow, carried its own significance, honoring Jon Arryn, while marking the child's supposed bastard status in ways that would protect him from those who might otherwise view his bloodline as a threat to their own ambitions. It was a careful balance between recognition and concealment, acknowledging the boy's worth while hiding his true heritage from a world that would not understand the complexities of his parentage. The journey back to Winterfell with Lyanna's body and her son marked the end of one story and the beginning of another, as Ned carried with him both the resolution of the mystery that had started the rebellion and the seeds of future conflicts that would test the realm's stability in ways that Robert's War had never attempted. The Tower of Joy had provided its answers, but those answers brought with them responsibilities that would define the remainder of Ned Stark's life. In saving one child, he had perhaps doomed himself to a future where honor and duty pulled in different directions, where the truth he valued above all else became a luxury he could no longer afford. The wheel of history had turned once again, and the man who emerged from that bloody tower was both the same Ned Stark who had entered it and someone entirely different, shaped by knowledge that would isolate him even from those he loved most. The Song of Ice and Fire had found its voice in a bastard boy who would never know his true name, while the realm celebrated a peace built on foundations that only one man truly understood. The Iron Throne had never seemed so imposing as it did on the day Robert Baratheon first climbed its twisted steps to claim the crown that 3 centuries of Targaryen rule had made synonymous with absolute power. The seat that Aegon the Conqueror had forged from the swords of defeated enemies now bore a new king, one whose claim rested not on ancient bloodlines or dragon fire, but on the strength of his arm and the justice of his cause. Robert's coronation took place in the Great Sept of Baelor, its crystal dome, allowing natural light to illuminate ceremonies that had been planned to demonstrate both continuity with the past and the dawn of a new era. The High Septon who placed the crown upon Robert's brow spoke of divine mandate and the god's favor, but everyone present understood that this kingship had been won through human courage and sacrifice rather than mystical inheritance. The crown itself was a masterwork of the goldsmith's art, crafted specifically for this occasion since the Targaryen crown had been lost when Prince Viserys fled to Dragonstone with his mother and the remnants of the royal treasury. Robert's crown featured antlers rather than dragons, its design reflecting both his personal sigil and his determination to establish a distinctly Baratheon dynasty that would govern according to different principles than those that had guided his predecessors. The great lords who knelt before their new king represented a realm transformed by rebellion, their presence marking the formal end of Targaryen rule, while acknowledging the new realities that would shape Westeros for generations to come. Jon Arryn's position at Robert's right hand surprised no one, the elderly Lord of the Vale having earned his place as hand through years of wise counsel and unwavering loyalty to the rebellion's cause. Ned Stark's appointment as Warden of the North formalized his inheritance of responsibilities that had come to him through tragedy, his father and brother's deaths having thrust him into a role he had never expected to hold. The quiet wolf, who had grown up as a second son, now commanded the loyalty of one of the realm's most powerful regions, his authority backed by the same northern lords who had followed the Starks for thousands of years. The distribution of rewards and punishments that followed Robert's coronation revealed both his generous nature and the complex political calculations necessary to maintain stability in a realm recently torn by civil war. Houses that had supported the rebellion received confirmation of their traditional rights and privileges, along with additional honors that reflected their service during the war's darkest moments. More controversial was Robert's treatment of those who had remained loyal to the Targaryens throughout the conflict. The new king's instinct toward mercy conflicted with his advisors' concerns about future rebellions, creating tensions that would influence royal policy for years to come. Some former Targaryen supporters received full pardons and retained their lands, while others faced varying degrees of punishment that reflected both their level of involvement in opposing the rebellion and their willingness to accept the new regime. Lord Tywin Lannister's position in the new order proved particularly complex, his late entry into the rebellion having secured victory while creating obligations that would reshape the realm's political landscape. The Lord of Casterly Rock's reward for his service included not only confirmation of his traditional authority, but also the opportunity to arrange his daughter Cersei's marriage to the new king, a union that would bind the realm's two most powerful houses together through blood and mutual interest. The marriage negotiations that preceded Robert and Cersei's wedding revealed the calculating nature of high politics, where personal feelings were subordinated to dynastic considerations that extended far beyond individual happiness or compatibility. Robert's love for Lyanna Stark had died with her in the Tower of Joy, leaving him emotionally hollow yet politically obligated to form alliances that would strengthen his reign. Cersei Lannister brought to the marriage both her family's vast wealth and her own formidable intelligence, qualities that made her a valuable partner in the complex game of throne politics. Despite the absence of romantic affection between bride and groom, the union promised to produce heirs who would carry both Baratheon and Lannister blood, creating bloodline claims that would stabilize the new dynasty while satisfying the ambitions of both families. The royal wedding celebrations provided an opportunity for the realm to demonstrate its acceptance of the new regime, while allowing Robert to display the generosity and magnificence that subjects expected from their kings. The festivities lasted for days, with tournaments and feasts that brought together nobles from every corner of Westeros in a grand display of unity and prosperity. However, beneath the surface celebrations lay deeper problems that threatened the stability Robert sought to establish. The war's cost had been enormous, not just in human lives but in economic terms, with the royal treasury depleted by years of military expenditure, while trade routes remained disrupted by the conflict's aftermath. The new king inherited debts that would require careful management and economic growth to resolve without imposing crushing tax burdens on subjects already exhausted by war. The appointment of key administrative positions revealed Robert's reliance on proven administrators rather than political favorites, a pragmatic approach that served the realm well despite limiting opportunities for rewarding loyalty with lucrative offices. Pycelle retained his position as Grand Maester despite his previous service to the Targaryens, his expertise and knowledge of court procedures proving more valuable than symbolic gestures that might have satisfied political supporters. Varys the Spider's continued service as Master of Whisperers demonstrated Robert's understanding that effective governance required information networks that transcended political loyalties. The eunuch's web of informants had served the previous regime faithfully, but his true allegiance was to the realm's stability rather than any particular dynasty, making him valuable to any king wise enough to utilize his capabilities. The challenges facing the new regime extended beyond mere administration to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority and the relationship between king and subjects. Robert's claim to the throne rested on conquest rather than inheritance, a precedent that could encourage future rebellions if his rule proved unpopular or ineffective. More immediately pressing was the need to deal with remaining Targaryen loyalists who had not yet accepted the dynasty's fall. Dragonstone remained under the control of Queen Rhaegar and her surviving children, their presence across the narrow sea serving as a rallying point for those who hoped for eventual restoration. The young Prince Viserys and his infant sister Daenerys represented potential threats that could not be ignored despite their current powerlessness. The decision to allow the surviving Targaryens to escape rather than pursuing them to Dragonstone reflected both Robert's merciful nature and his advisor's calculation that martyrdom might prove more dangerous than exile. Dead princes could become symbols of injustice, while living ones in distant exile posed manageable threats that could be monitored and contained through conventional diplomatic and intelligence means. The realm's military reorganization required careful balance between maintaining sufficient forces to defend against external threats while avoiding the expense and political dangers associated with large standing armies. The regional militias that had formed the backbone of rebel forces were gradually disbanded, their members returning to civilian occupations while retaining the training and experience that would make them valuable in future conflicts. Robert's establishment of a new royal household reflected his desire to surround himself with men whose loyalty had been proven through shared hardship rather than mere political calculation. Veterans of the rebellion found themselves elevated to positions of responsibility that would have been unthinkable under the previous regime's emphasis on ancient bloodlines and court connections. The cultural changes that accompanied political transformation proved more subtle but equally significant in their long-term implications. The court that had celebrated Targaryen traditions and ancient Valyrian customs gradually adapted to reflect Baratheon values and the martial culture that had enabled the rebellion's success. Songs and stories that had once glorified dragon kings were replaced by tales of heroic rebels fighting against tyranny and madness. Religious policy under the new regime maintained traditional tolerance while acknowledging the faith's role in legitimizing Robert's rule through appropriate ceremonies and public support. The High Septon's blessing had provided crucial validation during the coronation, but the crown's relationship with religious authorities remained carefully balanced to avoid either dependence or conflict. The legal reforms that followed Robert's coronation addressed some of the worst abuses that had characterized Aerys's final years, while maintaining enough continuity to ensure that the realm's judicial system continued to function effectively. The use of wildfire as an execution method was formally banned, while procedures were established to prevent the kind of arbitrary justice that had sparked the rebellion in the first place. Trade and commerce began to recover as merchants and craftsmen adjusted to the new political reality, their confidence restored by evidence that the realm would enjoy the stability necessary for long-term planning and investment. The removal of the Mad King's unpredictable policies created opportunities for economic growth that had been impossible during the previous regime's chaotic final years. Regional autonomy was carefully balanced against central authority, with the great houses retaining traditional privileges while acknowledging the crown's ultimate supremacy in matters of national importance. This delicate arrangement required constant attention and occasional adjustment, but it provided the flexibility necessary to govern a realm as large and diverse as the Seven Kingdoms. The personal cost of Robert's triumph became apparent as the excitement of victory gave way to the grinding responsibilities of daily governance. The young king, who had thrived on the battlefield, found himself trapped behind desk and throne, dealing with petitions and administrative details that offered none of the satisfaction or clear resolution that military campaigns provided. Most painfully, the knowledge that Lyanna was gone forever cast a shadow over victories that might otherwise have brought genuine happiness. Robert had won a crown but lost the woman who had made that crown seem worth winning, leaving him with power he had never truly wanted and responsibilities he was still learning to bear. The new order that emerged from the rebellion's ashes was neither the romantic restoration of ancient virtues that some supporters had envisioned, nor the revolutionary transformation that enemies had feared. Instead, it represented a pragmatic compromise between competing interests and ideologies, a system that promised stability and justice while acknowledging the complex realities of governing a fractured realm. The Iron Throne remained unchanged despite its new occupant, its twisted metal serving as a constant reminder that power came with prices that could never be fully calculated in advance. Robert Baratheon had claimed his crown through courage and determination, but keeping it would require different virtues entirely, skills that only time would reveal whether he possessed in sufficient measure to succeed where so many previous kings had failed. The war that had consumed the Seven Kingdoms for over a year finally drew to its close like a storm that had exhausted itself against the mountains, leaving behind a landscape forever changed by the fury of its passing. Across the realm, from the wall in the north to the summer sea in the south, men and women emerged from the shadow of conflict to discover what remained of the world they had known, and what new possibilities awaited in the peace that followed. In Winterfell's Godswood, the ancient weirwood continued its eternal vigil, its carved face bearing witness to the return of House Stark's surviving son, now a lord in his own right, carrying burdens that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. Ned had come home bearing not only the bones of his father and brother for burial in the crypts below, but also a secret that would shape every decision he made for the remainder of his days. The bastard boy he claimed as his own grew strong in the northern air, his dark hair and grey eyes marking him as unmistakably Stark to all who saw him, though none suspected the truth that lay beneath the obvious resemblance. Jon Snow would know only that Ned Stark was his father, a lie that protected him from dangers he could never understand while denying him knowledge of a heritage that might have changed the course of history itself. Caitlin Stark adapted to her new role as Lady of Winterfell, with the grace and intelligence that had made her valuable to House Tully, though the presence of her husband's bastard son served as a constant reminder of the complexities that surrounded even the most honorable men. Her acceptance of circumstances beyond her control demonstrated the pragmatic wisdom that noble women required to navigate the treacherous currents of political marriage and dynastic obligation. In King's Landing, Robert Baratheon struggled with the daily reality of kingship, discovering that the crown he had won through courage and strength required different virtues entirely to wear successfully. The Iron Throne's twisted metal seemed designed to remind its occupant that power came with pain, each small cut and scrape serving as a physical manifestation of the prices that authority demanded from those who claimed it. The city itself bore scars from the war's conclusion, buildings damaged during the sack slowly being repaired, while families mourned losses that could never be restored. Yet life continued with the resilience that had sustained humanity through countless cycles of conflict and peace, merchants reopening their shops while children played games that transformed the rebellion's heroes and villains into figures of legend and song. Cersei Lannister's adjustment to her role as queen proved as complex as anyone might have expected. Her intelligence and ambition constrained by the political realities that governed royal marriages throughout Westerosi history. The golden-haired beauty who had dreamed of love and romance found herself bound to a husband whose heart remained buried with a northern girl, their union serving political necessity rather than personal fulfillment. The children born to their marriage would grow up in a world shaped by their parents' experiences during the rebellion, inheriting both the privileges of royalty and the psychological legacy of a war that had demonstrated the fragility of dynastic power. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen would know only the peace that their father's victory had secured, their understanding of conflict limited to stories and songs rather than personal experience. Jon Arryn's service as Hand of the King provided the administrative competence and political wisdom that Robert's reign required to succeed, the elderly lord's experience helping to navigate the complex challenges of governing a realm still healing from civil war. His marriage to Lysa Tully produced the heir that duty demanded while creating family connections that would influence the realm's political landscape for generations to come. In the Riverlands, House Tully worked to repair the damage that had made their fertile valleys a battleground, their strategic position having brought both political advantage and devastating destruction to their ancestral lands. Hoster Tully's daughters had secured valuable marriages, but the cost had been measured in burned villages and disrupted harvests that would require years to fully restore. The North settled back into its ancient rhythms, the harsh land reclaiming its children with the indifferent embrace of winter winds and endless forests. The lords who had followed House Stark to war returned to their own holdings carrying memories of southern battles, alongside renewed appreciation for the stark beauty and honest simplicities of their homeland. Throughout the Seven Kingdoms, small communities that had been touched by war began the slow process of healing and rebuilding, their resilience tested but not broken by the conflicts that had raged far above their heads. Farmers replanted fields that had been trampled by armies, while craftsmen resumed trades that had been interrupted by the demands of military production. The songs and stories that emerged from the rebellion's conclusion would grow and change with each telling, transforming historical figures into legendary heroes whose deeds transcended the mundane realities of politics and warfare. Robert's warhammer would become a symbol of righteous strength, while Rhaegar's death at the Trident would inspire countless tales of tragic princes whose noble intentions led to doom. Yet beneath these grand narratives lay smaller stories of ordinary people who had endured extraordinary times, their individual experiences of loss and survival providing the human foundation upon which larger historical patterns were built. Widows learned to manage properties their husbands had once controlled, while orphans discovered new families among those who had shared their hardships. The realm's future stretched ahead like an unwritten book, its pages waiting to be filled with the consequences of choices made during the rebellion's chaotic months. The political settlements that had ended the war would be tested by time and circumstance, their durability dependent on the wisdom and restraint of those who inherited power from the conflict's survivors. Winter approached from the north with its usual inevitability, the changing seasons providing a reminder that some cycles were beyond human influence or control. The harsh months ahead would test the new order's stability while providing opportunities for reflection on the lessons that war had taught about the nature of justice, honor, and the prices that both demanded from those who claimed to serve them. The Iron Throne endured unchanged, despite its new occupant, its twisted metal, a testament to the permanence of power, even as those who wielded it came and went like seasons turning. The Game of Thrones would continue long after Robert's rebellion had become history, new players emerging to pursue ancient ambitions with methods both familiar and innovative. In the end, the rebellion had achieved its immediate goals while creating new challenges that would define the realm's future development. The Mad King was dead, his dynasty ended, and justice had been served for the crimes that had sparked the uprising. Yet the wheel of history continued turning, carrying with it the seeds of future conflicts that would test whether the peace so dearly won could be maintained by those who inherited its benefits. The Song of Ice and Fire had begun, though few recognized its opening notes or understood the themes that would define its development through the years to come. In Winterfell, a bastard boy grew strong and true, his true heritage hidden by love and lies that protected a secret capable of reshaping the world itself. Thank you for joining me on this epic journey through one of the most consequential periods in Westerosi history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Robert's Rebellion, please consider subscribing for more explorations into the rich history and hidden mysteries of the Seven Kingdoms. Until next time, may your nights be filled with dreams of dragons and direwolves, of honor and betrayal, and of the endless dance of power that shapes the fate of kings and commoners alike.